May 30th, 1857 marked the day the heavy iron-rimmed wheels of the Anderson family wagon finally ceased their grinding rotation against the limestone-riddled earth of the Kansas Territory. Coming to a halt in the high grass near Bluff Creek, where the air hung heavy with the smell of wet soil and impending violence. The journey from Kentucky had stripped away any veneer of Southern gentility the family might have once claimed, leaving behind a clan hardened by the road and fueled by the aggressive, restless spirit of the patriarch William C. Anderson. 17-year-old William T. Anderson sat on the buckboard, his eyes scanning the endless, undulating horizon of the Flint Hills, not with wonder, but with a cold, predatory assessment that would come to define his existence. The region was already bleeding, a festering wound of political hatred between Free Staters and pro-slavery settlers, and the Andersons were driving a stake right into the center of the infection. The family settled in Agnes City, a rugged collection of structures that barely qualified as a town, situated just northeast of Council Grove. Life in the territory demanded a callousness that young William adopted with frightening speed. He worked alongside his father and brothers, Ellis and Jim, building a rough log structure that would serve as their home. The labor was grueling, involving the felling of hardwoods and the dragging of stone, causing their hands to become permanent landscapes of calluses and scars. During these early months, the boy spoke little, his silence often mistaken for shyness. But those who looked closely saw a void in his expression, a lack of empathy that made him excellent at breaking horses. He treated the animals not as partners but as beasts to be dominated, using force with a clinical precision that unnerved the local farmers. By the winter of 1859, the Anderson reputation had begun to curdle. The father, William C., did not content himself with farming the rocky soil. He saw the lawless nature of the border not as a danger but as a business opportunity. The elder Anderson began to traffic in horses that had questionable ownership histories, moving animals between Missouri and Kansas, exploiting the confusion of the border. Young William became his primary lieutenant in these excursions. They rode through the night, traversing the muddy, frozen trails, guiding strings of stolen livestock through the scrub oak and ravines. The cold wind bit into their faces, turning their skin raw, but William never complained. He learned the geography of the land in the dark, memorizing the creek beds, the hidden draws, and the isolated cabins of Union sympathizers that would later become his hunting grounds. The outbreak of the Civil War in April of 1861 acted as an accelerant on the smoldering tension in Council Grove. The population was heavily divided, but the Unionists held the legal authority. Prominent figure in the area, Judge Arthur Baker, emerged as the primary antagonist to the Anderson clan. Baker was a man of the law, staunchly Unionist, and possessed a rigid intolerance for the Southern sympathizing, thieving Andersons. The friction was not merely political, it was personal and territorial. Baker looked at the Andersons and saw trash that needed to be swept from the county. William C. Anderson looked at Baker and saw a tyrant standing in the way of his livelihood. Throughout the autumn of 1861, the raids intensified. Young William, now 21, had grown into a wire-thin, intense figure. He wore his hair long, a habit that would become a trademark, and his proficiency with a revolver had surpassed that of his father. The family operation shifted from simple theft to ideologically driven plunder. They targeted Union men specifically, rationalizing their greed with the rhetoric of the Southern cause. They stole horses from Free Staters, sold them in Missouri, and returned with weapons and whiskey. The local law enforcement, backed by Baker, began to close the net. Whispers in the town general store turned to open accusations. The Andersons were no longer just neighbors. They were enemy combatants operating within the community. The winter of 1861 into 1862 was harsh, burying the plains in drifts of snow that isolated the homesteads. Inside the Anderson cabin, the atmosphere was poisonous. The father drank heavily, railing against Baker and the Unionists, feeding the fire of victimization in his sons. William sat by the hearth, cleaning his pistols, absorbing the hatred. He watched the flames consume the wood, his mind already working through scenarios of retribution. The isolation bred a unique form of paranoia. Every rider on the horizon was a potential marshal. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a raid. This pressure cooker environment stripped away William's remaining moral inhibitions. He began to view every human interaction as a zero-sum game where the only way to ensure survival was to strike first and strike harder. By the spring of 1862, the legal pressure from Judge Baker became tangible. Baker had gathered evidence of the horse thefts and was preparing to execute warrants. The judge was a formidable man, not easily intimidated, and he made it known that he intended to see the Andersons in irons or in the ground. The threat drove the elder Anderson into a frenzy. He refused to flee, his pride anchoring him to the conflict. He believed he could intimidate Baker, that the law was brittle in the face of sufficient force. William watched his father's bluster with a detached calculation. He knew that intimidation would not work on a man like Baker. It would require something final. On the first day of July 1862, the tension snapped. The specifics of the catalyst were disputed by the locals. Some said it was a specific warrant for the arrest of the father, others claimed it was a dispute over a stolen gun. But the result was kinetic. William C. Anderson, fueled by whiskey and rage, rode to the Council Grove courthouse to confront the judge. He took a gun, a weapon of close-range devastation. He did not go to talk. He went to assert dominance. Young William did not ride with him that morning, a fact that would haunt the narrative of the day. The elder Anderson arrived at the courthouse, screaming insults, calling the judge out. Baker, however, was not a man to be caught unaware. He stepped into view at the doorway, a gun of his own in hand. The confrontation was brief. There were no lengthy speeches. Anderson raised his weapon, but Baker was faster, or perhaps just more ready to kill. The judge's gun roared, a deafening blast that shattered the morning stillness. The heavy charge of buckshot caught William C. Anderson in the chest. The impact lifted him from his feet and threw him backward into the dust. The damage was catastrophic. The spread of the shot tore through his lungs and heart, killing him almost instantly. His blood soaked into the dry Kansas dirt, turning the soil a deep, muddy red. Word of the killing reached the Anderson cabin within the hour. When William heard the news, he did not weep. Witnesses stated that his face went completely slack, draining of all color. He stood motionless for a long time, looking at the messenger. The death of his father removed the last restraint on his psyche. Until this moment, he had been a criminal apprentice, following the violent whims of his patriarch. Now he was the head of the family, and he was possessed by a cold, crystalline clarity. The law had killed his father, therefore the law was the enemy. Judge Baker was not just a man. He was the embodiment of the system that had destroyed his world. William and his brother Jim retrieved the body. They washed the blood from their father's chest, dressing him for burial. The funeral was a grim, hurried affair, attended by a handful of sympathizers and family members. As the dirt was shoveled onto the pine coffin, William stared at the grave. He made a vow then, not spoken aloud, but etched into his behavior from that point forward. He would not seek justice through the courts. He would deliver a verdict of his own. The transformation was complete. The horse thief was dead. The guerrilla was born. 2 days later, on the 3rd of July, 1862, William and Jim Anderson rode to the home of Arthur Baker. They did not ride with the drunken fury of their father. They rode with the calm demeanor of men going to a market. They wore heavy coats despite the July heat, concealing the arsenal of revolvers strapped to their waists. They arrived at Baker's large two-story stone house, which also served as a store and post office. It was a fortress of local union authority. Baker was inside with his brother-in-law, George Sager. The Andersons dismounted and approached. The building? They entered the store area, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Baker looked up, surprised to see the sons of the man he had just killed. He expected retaliation, but he did not expect this level of brazen confidence. William spoke first, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He asked to see the judge in the back room, feigning a desire to settle the father's estate or discuss a truce. It was a ruse, a manipulation of social norms that the savage conflict had not yet fully eroded. Baker, wary but perhaps believing that the sons wanted to avoid their father's fate, allowed them into the living quarters. The moment the door closed, the pretense evaporated. William drew his revolver, an old Navy Colt, the metal cool and familiar in his grip. There was no hesitation. He fired point blank at Judge Baker. The ball struck Baker in the torso, staggering him. Baker, a large and powerful man, tried to fight back, grappling with his attackers. At the same time, Jim Anderson opened fire on George Sager. The room erupted in a cacophony of black powder explosions and smoke. The smell of sulfur filled the confined space instantly, stinging the eyes and throat. Baker, though wounded, managed to retreat to the cellar door, crashing through it to the darkness below. Sager was not as fortunate. He took a ball to the chest and collapsed, gasping for air, his lungs filling with fluid. William did not flee immediately. He moved to the cellar door, firing into the darkness, determined to finish the job. He could hear the judge groaning below. Satisfied that the wounds were mortal, or perhaps hearing the approach of neighbors alerted by the gunfire, the Anderson brothers exited the house. They walked calmly to their horses, holstering their hot weapons. They mounted and rode out of Council Grove, not at a gallop, but at a steady trot, signaling their contempt for the town and its inhabitants. Judge Baker lingered in agony. The ball had done massive internal damage. He died shortly after, his constitution unable to overcome the trauma. Sager also succumbed to his wounds. The double murder sent a shockwave through the region. This was not a drunken brawl or a duel. It was an assassination. It was a declaration of war against the unionist structure of the county. The Andersons fled south and west, moving deeper into the unsettled territory, to avoid the immediate posse that formed. They hid in the ravines and limestone caves that William knew so well. For days they lived like wolves, sleeping on the hard ground, eating whatever game they could kill. During these nights, William sat awake, watching the stars. He replayed the killing in his mind, not with regret, but with study. He analyzed the angles, the reaction times, the effectiveness of the rounds. He realized that the pistol was superior to the shotgun or the musket for the kind of war he intended to fight. It was personal, intimate, and rapid. The brutality of the act severed William's ties to normal society. He was now a wanted man with a price on his head. There was no going back to farming, no return to a quiet life. The only path forward was deeper into the violence. He began to attract others who were on the run, men who had burned their bridges with the law. They looked at William and saw a leader who was willing to cross lines that others feared. He did not talk about politics or grand strategy. He talked about survival and revenge. In late July of 1862, the small band moved east, drifting toward the Missouri border where the guerrilla war was hotter, more organized. William rode at the head of the column. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the tree lines. He began to experiment with the equipment of his trade. He acquired more revolvers, realizing that reloading in a fight was a death sentence. He started carrying 2, then 3 pistols. He practiced shooting from the saddle, galloping his horse past trees and putting rounds into the bark until his aim was instinctive. The environment of the border in the summer of 1862 was a pressure cooker of humidity and fear. The corn stood high in the fields, providing perfect cover for ambush. The roads were empty, the locals terrified to travel. Every farmhouse was a potential fortress or a trap. William learned to read the signs of the land, the disturbed dust that indicated a passing column, the silence of birds that warned of men hiding in the brush. He also began to cultivate his appearance. He understood the power of psychological warfare. He let his hair grow longer, washing it infrequently, letting it hang in greasy, dark curtains around his face. He wore high cavalry boots and shirts that were often stolen from his victims. He wanted to be recognized. He wanted the Union soldiers to know who he was before he killed them. The anonymity of the common soldier was not for him. He was becoming Bloody Bill, though the name had not yet been printed in the papers. The persona was under construction, brick by bloody brick. As they crossed into Missouri, the scale of the conflict expanded. They were no longer just fighting a local judge. They were entering a theater of war occupied by federal armies. The stakes were higher, the enemies more numerous. But William was ready. The killing of Baker had unlocked a chamber in his mind that contained a bottomless reserve of cruelty. He found that he enjoyed the power of life and death. He enjoyed the look of terror in a man's eyes in the seconds before he pulled the trigger. It was a drug more potent than the whiskey his father had consumed. The transition from the grieving son to the cold-blooded killer was absolute. There was no hesitation in his actions, no moral debate. When they encountered a Union sympathizer on the road in late July, a man merely carrying mail, William shot him without breaking his stride. He did not check the body. He did not search for intelligence. He killed the man, simply because he could, because the man represented the other side. This random casual violence shocked even the hard men riding with him, but they did not question him. They feared him. The Kansas soil had birthed him, but the blood of his father had baptized him. As July 1862 drew to a close, William T. Anderson was no longer a resident of any town or a citizen of any state. He was a creature of the brush, a phantom of the borderlands. The seeds of rage had germinated, fed by the rich, blood-soaked earth, and they were about to bloom into a harvest of horror that the West had never seen. The innocent boy who had arrived on the wagon in '57 was gone, replaced by a vessel of pure, concentrated hate. The war had just gained its most efficient monster. July 5, 1862, found William Anderson riding hard away from Council Grove, the memory of the gunfire and the flames that killed Judge Baker still ringing in his ears. He was 22 years old, and the Kansas border was shrinking behind him. He rode east, crossing the invisible line into Missouri, a state that was less a political entity and more a sprawling, chaotic battlefield. The heat was oppressive, shimmering off the tall prairie grass, baking the dust into a fine powder that coated his throat and stung his eyes. He was no longer a civilian criminal. He was a combatant in a war that recognized no rules. The transition was immediate. He traded the open plains for the dense, tangled thickets of the Missouri river bottoms. The brush. This was a world of shadow and ambush, of limestone ravines choked with scrub oak and blackberry brambles, where a man could vanish 10 feet from the road and never be seen again. Anderson drifted into Jackson County, a region teeming with Southern sympathizers and Union patrols. He was not yet a captain. He was raw material, a killer in search of a methodology. He found it in the camps of the bushwhackers. These men were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They wore hunting shirts embroidered with flowers by their sweethearts, carried 4 or 6 revolvers stuffed into their belts and saddle holsters, and rode the best horseflesh in the state. They were a hybrid of cavalryman and bandit, operating on a doctrine of total war. Anderson watched them with the same intense scrutiny he had once applied to breaking horses. He observed how they moved, how they slept with one eye open, and most importantly, how they killed. In the late summer of 1862, Anderson fell in with a small band operating on the fringes of William Quantrill's larger organization. Quantrill was the undisputed king of the guerrillas, a former schoolteacher turned tactician who had codified the rules of the bushwhackers. Anderson studied Quantrill from a distance, absorbing the lessons of the master. The first lesson was mobility. A guerrilla who stopped moving was a dead guerrilla. They lived in the saddle, eating dried beef and hardtack while on the move, sleeping in short bursts with the reins tied to their wrists. Anderson's body hardened to the rhythm of the horse. His thighs became bands of iron, his hands permanently curved to fit the grip of a Colt revolver or the leather of the reins. The first true skirmish for Anderson came in early August. It was a small affair, a raid on a Union supply wagon near Independence. The plan was simple: hit them hard, take what was valuable, and disappear before the escort could rally. Anderson lay in the tall grass on a ridge overlooking the road. The sun beat down on his back, the sweat trickling down his spine, but he did not move. He let the flies bite him without flinching. When the blue column appeared, a line of dust and noise, he felt a surge of adrenaline that was colder, sharper than the rage he had felt toward Baker. This was business. The signal was given, a single whistle from the brush. Anderson rose and fired. The ambush was a chaotic eruption of noise and smoke. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the air was filled with the zip and thud of heavy lead balls. Anderson did not fire wildly. He picked a target, a young private driving the lead wagon, and squeezed the trigger. The man slumped forward, tumbling over the dashboard. Anderson advanced, moving down the slope, firing as he walked. He saw a Union sergeant trying to unlimber a carbine. Anderson shifted his aim and put a ball through the man's shoulder, spinning him around. The violence was fast, brutal, and intimate. Within minutes, the escort was scattered or dead. After the looting, as they stripped the wagons of ammunition and food, Anderson walked among the bodies. He did not look away. He looked at the faces of the dead men, noting the shock frozen in their expressions. He was learning the anatomy of death. He saw that a man shot in the gut died slow and loud, while a man shot in the head dropped like a sack of feed. He saw that mercy was a weakness that got you killed. If you left a wounded man alive, he could still pull a trigger. If you let a prisoner go, he would come back with a regiment. The logic of the brush dictated that the only safe enemy was a dead one. Throughout the autumn of 1862, the war grew uglier. General John Schofield, commanding the Union forces in Missouri, issued orders that treated guerrillas as outlaws rather than soldiers. This meant summary execution if caught. The black flag, the symbol of no quarter given or asked, became the unofficial banner of the bushwhackers. Anderson embraced this reality. He understood that if he was captured, there would be no trial, no prison camp. There would be a rope or a firing squad. This knowledge liberated him. Since death was the only penalty, there was no limit to the violence he could inflict to avoid it. Winter descended on Missouri with a vengeance. The trees lost their leaves, stripping away the cover that the guerrillas relied on. The bands broke up into smaller groups to survive, hiding in the homes of sympathizers or in dugout caves deep in the woods. Anderson spent the winter of 1862 moving from barn to barn, sleeping in lofts, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the wood. It was a time of starvation and paranoia. Union patrols, the feds, were constantly scouring the countryside, burning houses and arresting anyone suspected of aiding the rebels. During these long, cold nights, Anderson's hatred solidified. He listened to the stories of the farmers who fed him, stories of Union jayhawkers burning crops, stealing livestock, and insulting women. He internalized their grievances. He saw himself not just as a fighter, but as an avenger for these people. He began to cultivate his image. He wore a Guerrilla shirt made of fine wool, heavily embroidered, and a hat with a plume. He wanted the Federals to see him coming. He wanted to be a figure of terror in their nightmares. By the spring of 1863, the grass returned, and with it the war season. Anderson emerged from the winter lean and hungry. He had gathered a small following of his own, men who recognized his ferocity. They were young, mostly in their late teens, boys who had been forced into the brush by the depredations of the Union occupation. Anderson was their older brother, their captain. He taught them how to clean their revolvers until the actions were smooth as glass. He taught them how to ride low on the horse's neck to present a smaller target. In May of 1863, Anderson led a raid on a small outpost near the Kansas border. It was a test of his leadership. He divided his men, sending one group to create a diversion while he led the main attack. They hit the outpost at dawn, the sun just cresting the trees. Anderson rode straight into the camp, a revolver in each hand, the reins in his teeth, a trick he had mastered over the winter. He fired rapidly, alternating hands, creating a wall of lead that suppressed the Union return fire. His men followed him, screaming the rebel yell, a high-pitched, terrifying sound that shattered the morning calm. They overran the camp in minutes. The Union soldiers, caught sleeping or making coffee, had no chance. Anderson cornered a lieutenant near the command tent. The officer raised his hands, surrendering. In a traditional war, this would be the end of the combat, but this was the border. Anderson looked at the man, saw the blue uniform that represented the system that killed his father, and fired. The lieutenant fell, a hole in his chest. Anderson turned to his men. "Take their horses," he ordered. "Burn the rest." They piled the tents, the supplies, and the bodies into a heap and set it alight. The column of black smoke rose high into the clear blue sky, a signal to the surrounding country that Bloody Bill was awake. As they rode away, Anderson did not look back at the pyre. He was already thinking about the next target. He was refining his mental map of the territory, marking the safe houses, the creek crossings, the ambush points. June of 1863 brought a shift in the Union strategy. General Thomas Ewing took command of the district of the border. Ewing was a sharp, ruthless administrator who understood that chasing guerrillas was futile. He decided to attack the civilian infrastructure that supported them. He began arresting the female relatives of the known guerrillas. This tactic was intended to break the morale of the bushwhackers, to force them to surrender to save their families. Anderson heard the rumors of the arrests. He knew his sisters were in Kansas City. The thought gnawed at him, a dull ache in the back of his mind, but he pushed it down. He believed, perhaps naively, that the war had limits, that the Federals would not harm women. Anderson's operations in July 1863 became more brazen. He began to target the mail coaches and the steamboats on the Missouri River. He realized that disrupting communication and commerce was just as damaging as killing soldiers. One afternoon, his band stopped a stagecoach on the road to Lexington. Anderson rode up to the driver, his pistol drawn. He ordered the passengers out. They were civilians. Merchants, a lawyer, a few women. Anderson walked down the line, inspecting them. He found a man carrying a dispatch bag for the Union Army. Anderson pulled the man out of the line. "You carry letters for the feds?" he asked, his voice quiet. The man stammered, trying to explain. Anderson didn't listen. He shot the man in the head, right there on the dusty road in front of the screaming passengers. He then turned to the others. "Tell Ewing," he said. "Tell him the mail doesn't run in my county." He let the others go. He needed witnesses. He needed fear to spread like a contagion. The violence was escalating on both sides. The Union troops, frustrated by their inability to catch the elusive guerrillas, began to take out their anger on the local population. They burned farmhouses suspected of harboring Anderson. They shot livestock in the fields. Anderson responded in kind. If the Federals burned a house, he ambushed a patrol. If they killed a civilian, he killed 2 soldiers. It was a mathematical equation of blood, a ledger that could never be balanced. By late July 1863, Anderson was a fully formed guerrilla chieftain. He moved with a predatory grace, his senses tuned to the frequency of danger. He could smell the coal smoke of a Union camp from a mile away. He could hear the click of a hammer being cocked in a noisy room. He was no longer the apprentice. He was a master of the brush. He had learned that cruelty was a tool, that terror was a weapon, and that the only law on the border was the law of the revolver. His band had grown to include some of the most dangerous men in Missouri. They were a motley, terrifying crew, dressed in mismatched uniforms, stripped from dead Federals, their horses decorated with scalps and ribbons. They looked like demons from a folklore tale, riding out of the mist to snatch souls. Anderson rode at their head, a grim, silent figure. He did not drink like the others. He did not boast. He saved his energy for the killing. One evening, camping near the Snaya Bar Creek, Anderson sat by the fire cleaning his guns. The metal was worn smooth from constant use. The cylinder clicked rhythmically as he rotated it. He looked into the flames and saw the face of Arthur Baker, the face of the Union lieutenant, the face of the mail carrier. They were all the same face now. They were the enemy. The distinction between the man who pulled the trigger and the man who gave the order had vanished. The war had stripped away everything. That made him William Anderson, the farm boy. He was now simply a force of nature, an inevitability. The path before him was dark and slick with gore, but he did not hesitate. He was committed to the ride. The brush had taught him well. It had hollowed him out and filled the empty space with gunpowder and bile. As July turned to August, the heat intensified, baking the land into a brick. The corn stood tall and yellow. The cicadas screamed in the trees, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Anderson sensed that a storm was coming. The minor skirmishes, the raids, the tit-for-tat killings. They were all leading to something massive, something that would break the world apart. He didn't know yet about the prison building in Kansas City. He didn't know that the structural beams were groaning under the weight of negligence. He didn't know that his sisters were sleeping in a tomb. But he was ready. He was honed. The apprentice of the brush had graduated. He checked the loads in his pistols, 6 chambers in each, capped and ready. He holstered them, the leather creaking softly. He lay back on his saddle blanket, looking up at the stars through the canopy of leaves. Tomorrow he would kill again. And the day after that. And every day until they put him in the ground. The education was over, the slaughter was just beginning. August 13th, 1863 dawned over Kansas City with a sweltering, relentless heat that promised to bake the brick and mortar of the town into a kiln. The sun rose steadily, burning off the river fog that clung to the bluffs, revealing a city occupied by the mechanics of war. At the heart of this occupation stood a dilapidated 3-story brick building on Grand Avenue, sandwiched between the metropole of Union authority and the commercial bustle of a frontier town. This structure, known locally as the Thomas Building, had been requisitioned by General Thomas Ewing to serve as a makeshift detention facility for the female relatives of the Missouri guerrillas. Inside the stifling, airless rooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors, the sisters of William Anderson, Josephine, Mary, and Martha, woke to another day of captivity. The atmosphere inside the prison was heavy with stagnant air and dread. The windows were secured, allowing little ventilation to combat the August humidity that turned the interior into a sweat box. Josephine Anderson, 14 years old, sat near a peeling wall listening to the sounds of the street below. The rumble of heavy supply wagons, the shouting of teamsters, and the rhythmic tramp of marching boots drifted up through the floorboards. These sounds were the soundtrack of their imprisonment, a constant reminder of the military machine that held them hostage. Her sisters, 16-year-old Mary and 10-year-old Martha, stayed close. The room was crowded with other women and children, the wives and sisters of men like Cole Younger and John McCorkle, all packed together in a space never designed for human habitation on such a scale. The building itself was a rotting shell. Originally constructed for commercial use, it had fallen into disrepair long before the Union Army seized it. The brickwork was old and porous, the mortar crumbling into dust at the touch. On the ground floor, Union guards occupied a space that had once been a grocery, drinking coffee and playing cards, indifferent to the structural groans of the edifice above them. Below ground, in the cellar, a more sinister activity was taking place. Soldiers had been digging around the foundation supports, ostensibly searching for contraband or creating more storage space. But the women upstairs could feel the vibrations. Every strike of a shovel or pickaxe against the earth sent a tremor through the fragile skeleton of the house. The prisoners had complained to the guards about the shifting floors and the cracks that appeared in the plaster, widening like spider webs with each passing day. The soldiers had dismissed them with sneers, telling them that if the building fell, it would save the government the trouble of feeding them. Throughout the morning of the 13th, the structural integrity of the Thomas building began to fail in slow motion. Dust drifted down from the ceiling constantly, coating the hair and clothes of the women in a fine gray powder. The floorboards creaked ominously even when no one was walking on them. Mary Anderson watched a crack in the wall near the window expand, shedding flakes of paint onto the floor. She held Martha's hand, feeling the tension in the small girl's grip. They were trapped in a vertical coffin suspended above the street, waiting for gravity to claim its due. The heat intensified as the sun reached its zenith, baking the brick walls until they radiated warmth like an oven. The air inside became thick and hard to breathe, smelling of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the dry, chalky scent of old plaster. Down on the street, the bustle of Kansas City continued, oblivious to the impending disaster. Provost Marshal officials walked the sidewalks, discussing the latest reports of bushwhacker activity. They viewed the women in the tower not as people, but as leverage, human pawns to be used to break the will of the guerrillas hiding in the brush. General Ewing believed that by imprisoning the support network, he could starve the insurgency. He did not calculate the physics of neglecting a ruin. He did not factor in the weight of dozens of people pressing down on weakened beams that had been undermined by the very soldiers guarding them. At roughly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the threshold of tolerance for the building's supports was crossed. There was no warning siren, no shout of alarm. The sound began as a deep, mournful groan from the timber skeleton, followed instantly by a sharp, cracking report that sounded like a field piece firing at close range. The central support beam in the cellar, compromised by the excavation, snapped under the load. The failure was catastrophic and immediate. The entire structure buckled inward. The walls blew out slightly before collapsing in on themselves, the floors pancaking one on top of the other in a terrifying cascade of destruction. For the women on the upper floors, the world simply disintegrated. The floor dropped away beneath their feet, plunging them into a chaotic void of falling masonry, splintering wood, and choking dust. Josephine Anderson was thrown violently downward, the breath driven from her lungs by the impact. Before she could even scream, the massive weight of the third floor crashed down upon the second, driving everything into the cellar. The noise was apocalyptic, a thunderous roar that shook the adjacent buildings and sent a massive cloud of debris billowing out into Grand Avenue, obscuring the sun. Silence followed the crash for a single horrifying heartbeat. Then the screams began. From the pile of rubble, which stood barely 1 story high where 3 had stood moments before, came the cries of the maimed and the dying. The scene was a jagged landscape of broken bricks and twisted timbers. Josephine Anderson lay buried deep within the ruin. A heavy beam had struck her, crushing her body instantly. She did not suffer long, the violence of the collapse extinguished, her life in the darkness of the cellar. Mary Anderson was trapped under a shifting mass of brick and wood. Her legs were pinned by debris, the bones shattered by the impact. She screamed for her sisters, her voice ragged with pain and terror, but her cries were swallowed by the confusion. Little Martha was struck by falling masonry, sustaining severe injuries that left her broken and bleeding, pinned in a pocket of space beneath the wreckage. The air in the cellar was thick with lime dust, clogging the throats of the survivors, blinding them as they thrashed in the dark. On the street, the reaction was pandemonium. Soldiers and civilians rushed toward the cloud of dust, their faces masks of shock. They began to tear at the bricks with their bare hands, desperate to reach the voices calling from below. The rescue effort was frantic and disorganized. Men shouted orders that went unheard over the din. They pulled beam after beam from the pile, exposing the horrors beneath. When they reached the bodies, the reality of the tragedy became clear. They pulled Josephine's lifeless form from the debris, her body limp and broken. They found the other women, some dead, some terribly injured, their dresses torn and covered in the gray dust of their prison. News of the collapse did not stay contained within the city limits. It radiated outward with the speed of a shockwave. Riders mounted fast horses and bolted from the city, carrying the story into the countryside. They rode through the heat of the afternoon, their mounts foaming with exertion, desperate to bring the word to the guerrilla camps. The story they carried was not one of an accident. In the context of the brutal border war, there were no accidents in the stories that spread through the brush. The narrative that formed immediately was one of deliberate murder. The Union was said to have undermined the building. The Union was said to have pulled the supports. The Union was said to have killed the women to get to the men. William Anderson was camped near the snippet of woods along the Blackwater River when the courier arrived. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the water. The camp was quiet, the men cleaning their weapons or tending to their horses. Anderson stood near his mount, a dark figure against the tree line. He watched the rider approach, noting the frantic pace of the horse. The courier slid from the saddle, his face streaked with sweat and dust, his chest heaving. He walked straight to Anderson, removing his hat. The man spoke the words that would alter the course of the war. He told Anderson that the prison on Grand Avenue had fallen. He told him that Josephine was dead. He told him that Mary was crippled for life and that Martha was maimed. He described the pile of bricks, the dust, the screams. He repeated the rumor that the soldiers had done it on purpose, that they had laughed as the walls came down. Anderson listened without moving. He did not interrupt. He did not shout. As the details washed over him, a terrifying physical change took hold. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, went flat and dead, like the eyes of a shark. The muscles in his jaw bunched as he ground his teeth together. The silence that stretched after the courier finished speaking was heavier than the humid air. The other men in the camp, Archie Clement, Frank James, the worst of the border killers, stopped what they were doing and watched their captain. For a long time, Anderson simply stared at the ground. Then a sound escaped him. It was not a sob. It was a low, guttural noise like an animal in a trap. He turned away from the men and walked into the dense brush. He did not want them to see him weep, but weep he did. He fell to his knees in the dirt, clutching the roots of an oak tree, his body shaking with a violent, spasmodic grief. He screamed into the earth, a raw, primal sound of agony that echoed through the woods. The loss of his father had made him a killer. The murder of his sister made him a monster. In that moment of solitude, William Anderson died. The man who had political opinions, who had a lingering connection to humanity, was extinguished. In his place rose a vessel of pure, distilled hatred. He stopped thinking in terms of military objectives. He stopped caring about the Confederacy or the Union. The war was no longer a conflict between armies, it was a personal vendetta against every man who wore a blue uniform. He made a vow to the darkening sky. He would not just kill them, he would butcher them. He would make them pay for every brick, every speck of dust, every drop of blood his sisters had shed. He returned to the fire an hour later. His face was dry, his expression set in stone. He looked at his men, and they saw the change. They saw a man who had severed his last tie to the civilized world. He spoke to them in a voice that sounded like gravel grinding on glass. "They killed her," he said. "They crushed her. There is no more war. There is only the hunt. We will kill them all. We will leave none of them standing." He went to his saddlebags and pulled out a length of silk cord. He sat by the fire and began to tie a knot in it. Then another, and another. The men watched him, understanding the ritual. He was keeping a tally. He was preparing a ledger of death. He sharpened his knife, the rasp of the stone against the steel, the only sound in the camp. The blade gleamed in the firelight, thirsty and waiting. The collapse of the prison acted as a powerful accelerant for the entire guerrilla movement. William Quantrill, camped nearby, saw the strategic value in the tragedy. He had been planning a massive raid on Lawrence, Kansas, the heart of the abolitionist movement, the home of the Jayhawkers. He had struggled to convince some of the more moderate captains to agree to the attack, which would target civilians. But now, with the news of the women's deaths, the hesitation evaporated. The prison collapse provided the moral justification they needed. It was an eye for an eye. If the Union could kill women in Kansas City, the guerrillas could burn Lawrence to the ground. Anderson became the most vocal advocate for the raid. He rode to Quantrill's camp, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He told Quantrill that he would ride into Lawrence and wash the streets in blood. He told him that he wanted to hear the town scream as his sisters had screamed. Quantrill looked at Anderson and saw a weapon of terrifying potential. He gave Anderson a prominent position in the formation. He knew that when the shooting started, Anderson would not stop until his arm was too tired to lift his revolver. The days following the collapse were a blur of frenzied activity. Anderson slept little, if at all. He paced the camp, checking weapons, inspecting horses. He was consumed by a singular focus. He demanded that his men prepare for total slaughter. He told them to leave their pity in the woods. "We are going to Kansas," he told them, "and we are going to kill everything that moves." The physiological toll on Anderson was visible. He grew thinner, his cheeks hollow, his eyes sunken and dark. He stopped eating regular meals, subsisting on coffee and hate. He began to exhibit the behaviors that would earn him the title of the bloodiest man in the war. He laughed at inappropriate times, a high, mirthless cackle that unsettled even his closest associates. He talked to his dead sister, whispering to the air as if she were riding beside him. On the morning of the departure for Lawrence, Anderson sat on his horse, looking over the assembled mass of 300 bushwhackers. They were a motley, dangerous army, heavily armed and motivated by revenge, but none were as motivated as Anderson. He touched the silk cord in his pocket, feeling the knots. He touched the hilt of his revolver. He looked toward the west, toward Kansas. The prison collapse had not just killed his sister, it had unleashed a demon. The structural failure of a single building in Kansas City had set in motion a chain of events that would result in the most infamous massacre of the Civil War. The column moved out, a long snake of dust and steel winding through the Missouri timber. Anderson rode near the front, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He did not see the trees or the river. He saw only the crumbling walls of the jail. He heard the snap of the beam. He felt the crushing weight. and he promised himself that before the sun set on Lawrence, he would build a monument of Union bodies high enough to reach the sky. The ride to Lawrence was not a military maneuver for him. It was a pilgrimage of slaughter. The tragedy in Kansas City had stripped away the last guardrails of civilized warfare. It signaled the end of the romantic notion of the noble partisan. From this point forward, the war on the border would be a descent into absolute barbarism. And leading the way with a smile devoid of all warmth was William Anderson. The collapse of the Grand Avenue prison had created the butcher of Centralia. The boy was gone. The man was gone. Only the killer remained. August 21st, 1863, arrived with a pale, ghostly light creeping over the eastern horizon of Kansas. The air was still and cool, a stark contrast to the inferno that was approaching from the southeast. William Anderson sat atop his horse on the crest of Mount Oread, looking down at the sleeping town of Lawrence. The settlement lay quiet between the Kansas River and the rising slopes, a grid of wooden homes, brick storefronts, and the dreams of abolitionist settlers. To the 350 dusty, heavily armed men sitting in saddles behind him, Lawrence was not a town. It was the head of the snake, the sanctuary of the Jayhawkers, and the source of the misery that had befallen their families in Missouri. To Anderson, it was a massive altar waiting for a sacrifice. The exhaustion of the all-night ride, covering 40 miles of hostile territory, vanished the moment the rooftops came into view. The ache in his back and the grit in his eyes were replaced by a surge of adrenaline that sharpened his vision to a crystalline clarity. William Quantrill, the tactical architect of the raid, gave the order to deploy. The command rippled down the line, not with bugles, but with the quiet, deadly click of hundreds of revolver hammers being cocked. Anderson spurred his horse forward, not waiting for the main body to organize a formal line. He wanted to be the first to draw blood. As the guerrillas descended the slope, their pace accelerated from a trot to a gallop. The thunder of hoofbeats broke the morning silence, a rolling tremor that woke the dogs first, then the early risers. By the time the column hit the main street, the noise was a deafening roar of shouting men and pounding hooves. Anderson rode with the reins in his teeth, a revolver in each hand, his long hair flying behind him like a banner of war. The attack began at 5 o'clock in the morning. The first civilians to emerge from their homes were met with immediate, lethal force. Anderson did not discriminate based on age or profession. If the target was male and old enough to hold a rifle, he was a combatant. He saw a man running across Massachusetts Street trying to reach the safety of a storefront. Anderson leveled his right-hand Colt and fired. The heavy ball struck the runner in the spine, dropping him face first into the dirt. Anderson did not slow down. He rode past the body, firing into the windows of the passing buildings, shattering glass and sending splinters of wood flying into the rooms where families were scrambling out of bed. The main body of the guerrillas fanned out, splitting into squads to cover the entire grid of the town. Quantrill headed for the Eldridge House, the massive brick hotel that served as the fortress of the Free State cause. Anderson, however, had no interest in negotiating surrenders or securing political prisoners. He peeled off from the main group, leading a pack of his most vicious followers, including Archie Clement, toward the residential districts. His objective was the extermination of the male population. He rode up to a white frame house where a man was trying to usher his wife and children out the back door. Anderson vaulted from his saddle before his horse had fully stopped. He kicked open the gate and marched up the path. The man, a shopkeeper named heavily in the local records, turned to face the intruder. He raised his hands, pleading for his life, shouting that he was a non-combatant. Anderson looked at him with eyes that held no recognition of humanity. He saw only a symbol of the regime that had crushed his sister. Anderson raised his pistol and shot the man in the chest. As the man fell, gasping for air, Anderson stepped over him and walked into the house. He overturned tables, smashed crockery, and set fire to the curtains with a lucifer match. He walked back out, stepping over the dying man again, and remounted his horse. The entire sequence took less than 2 minutes as the sun climbed higher. The violence intensified. The guerrillas broke into the recruiting camp where a group of unsworn Union recruits were sleeping. These young men, mostly teenagers, were unarmed and unprepared. They tumbled out of their tents in confusion, wearing only their underclothes. Anderson rode into the middle of the camp, firing point blank into the huddle of terrified boys. There was no attempt to take prisoners. The recruits tried to run, scattering into the ravines and cornfields, but Anderson and his men hunted them down. They rode alongside the runners, shooting them in the back of the head or the spine. One boy, cornered against a fence, fell to his knees and begged for mercy. Anderson rode up to him, leaned down from the saddle, and put a bullet through his forehead. The camp became a slaughterhouse, the ground slick with blood and covered in the bodies of the youth who had not yet fired a shot in the war. By 6 o'clock, the center of Lawrence was a chaotic scene of plunder and murder. The smoke from burning buildings began to coalesce into a thick, choking pall that blotted out the sun. The heat was intense, radiating from the fires and the sun baking the dusty streets. Anderson moved through the haze like a phantom. He had discarded his coat, his shirt soaked with sweat and black powder residue. He carried multiple revolvers, swapping them out as they ran dry, handing the empty ones to his younger associates to reload while he continued the work with fresh weapons. He did not participate in the looting that occupied many of the other bushwhackers. While others were stealing pianos, silver, and boots, Anderson was searching cellars and attics for hiding men. He found a group of men hiding in a ravine near the center of town. They were huddled together, praying. Anderson signaled to his men to surround the depression in the earth. He stood on the lip of the ravine, looking down at them. He spoke to them, his voice calm and carrying over the roar of the fire. He asked them if they were soldiers. They denied it. He asked them if they supported the Jayhawkers. They stayed silent. Anderson nodded as if accepting their answer, then raised his pistol. He fired methodically, picking them off one by one. The men scrambled, trying to climb the steep banks, but the guerrillas on the rim shot them down. The ravine filled with bodies, a tangled mass of limbs and bloody clothes. The brutality was personal and intimate. Anderson entered a house where a woman was shielding her husband. She stood between the guerrilla and her spouse, screaming at Anderson to stop. Anderson grabbed the woman by the arm and threw her aside with shocking force. He did not shoot her. The code of the bushwhacker, however twisted, still forbade the deliberate killing of women. But he made her watch. He shot her husband in the stomach, a wound calculated to cause maximum agony. He stood over the man as he writhed on the floor, watching the life drain out of him, while the wife's screams filled the room. Anderson wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, turned and walked out, leaving the woman with the corpse and the encroaching flames. By 7 o'clock, the Eldridge house had surrendered to Quantrill. The guests were herded out, stripped of their valuables, but largely spared their lives due to Quantrill's intervention. Anderson viewed this mercy with disgust. He avoided the hotel, preferring the streets where the rules were suspended. He rode down Massachusetts Street, which was now a canyon of fire. The heat was so intense it singed the hair on the horses. The wooden sidewalks were burning, the glass in the storefronts exploding outward from the pressure. Anderson's horse danced nervously, terrified of the flames, but Anderson held him steady with an iron grip. He scanned the smoke for movement, shooting at anything that looked like a man. He encountered a man named Judge Carpenter in the backyard of his home. Carpenter was already wounded, bleeding from a shot to the leg. He was trying to crawl into a garden shed. Anderson dismounted and walked toward him. Carpenter looked up, recognizing the long hair and the cold eyes of the guerrilla captain. He didn't beg. He simply looked at Anderson. Anderson shot him 3 times, ensuring the job was finished. He then took a piece of paper from his pocket, dipped his finger in Carpenter's blood, and wrote a name on the list he carried. It was a grim accounting, a way to quantify the vengeance he was exacting for his sister. The atmosphere in Lawrence was apocalyptic. The roar of the fire was so loud that men had to shout to be heard only a few feet away. The smell was a nauseating mixture of burning pine, melting tar, and roasted flesh. The dust in the streets had turned to a red paste where the blood had pooled. Anderson moved through this hellscape with a terrifying sense of purpose. He was not frenzied in the way a madman is. He was efficient, like a butcher, processing livestock. He checked the bodies to ensure they were dead. If he saw a man breathing, he put another round in him. He reloaded his pistols constantly, his hands black with grime, his fingers moving with practiced speed. The women of Lawrence displayed a desperate courage that even Anderson had to acknowledge. They dragged the bodies of their husbands and sons from the burning houses, trying to save the corpses from incineration. They threw water on the flames, risking their lives to save their homes. Anderson rode past them, ignoring their pleas and their curses. He was not there for them. He was there to kill the future of the town. He targeted the older boys, the ones who would be soldiers in a year or 2. He found a 14-year-old boy wearing a Union cap playing soldier in a backyard. Anderson shot him without breaking stride. The war had erased the line between child and soldier in his mind. As the morning wore on, the alcohol that some of the guerrillas had looted began to take effect. Discipline frayed. Men were riding drunk, firing wildly into the air, singing bawdy songs amidst the carnage. Anderson did not drink. He remained stone-cold sober, his intoxication coming solely from the violence. He rallied his specific band, keeping them focused on the killing. He ordered them to burn the offices of the local newspapers, the organs of abolitionist propaganda. He watched as the printing presses crashed through the burning floors, the heavy iron machines smashing into the basements. The target of the highest value, Senator Jim Lane, the leader of the Kansas Jayhawkers, managed to escape. He had fled his house in his nightshirt, hiding in a cornfield, listening to the screams of his neighbors. Anderson learned of the escape later in the morning. His rage was palpable. He rode to Lane's house, which was already engulfed in flames. He sat on his horse, staring at the burning structure, furious that the primary architect of the misery in Missouri had slipped through his fingers. He took out his frustration on the neighbors, ordering his men to burn every house on the block. "If we can't get the wolf," he told his men, "we burn the den." By 9 o'clock, the lookouts posted on Mount Oread signaled that Union cavalry was approaching from the east. The element of surprise was gone. It was time to leave. Quantrill ordered the withdrawal. The guerrillas began to reform their columns, loaded down with plunder. Anderson was one of the last to leave the town proper. He sat on his horse at the edge of the settlement, looking back at the devastation. Lawrence was a ruin. Nearly 200 men and boys lay dead in the streets and gardens. The business district was a smoking crater. The air was filled with the wailing of widows and orphans. Anderson felt a grim satisfaction. He had done what he came to do. He had balanced the scales, at least partially. He touched the pocket where he kept the silk cord, now heavy with knots. He turned his horse and galloped to catch up with the rear guard. The retreat would be dangerous, a running gun battle against pursuing federal troops, but Anderson was not afraid. He was energized. The raid on Lawrence had proved that the Union was vulnerable, that their homes could be violated just as the homes in Missouri had been. As they rode south, leaving the pillar of smoke behind them, Anderson wiped the grime from his face. His eyes were red-rimmed from the smoke, his ears ringing from the gunfire. He looked at his hands, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. They were stained with powder and blood. He did not wipe them clean. He wanted the stain to remain. He wanted to carry the evidence of Lawrence with him. The psychological impact of the raid on Anderson was profound. It validated his belief that total war was the only effective strategy. He had seen the terror in the eyes of the Kansans and he had savored it. He realized that he was no longer just a man with a grievance. He was a force of destruction. The sack of Lawrence was his masterpiece, a canvas painted in red and black. It was the event that would define him in the history books, the moment when Bloody Bill became more than a nickname. It became a description of his very soul. The column moved fast, the horses laboring under the heat. They crossed the Wakarusa River, heading back toward the sanctuary of the Missouri border. Anderson rode in the rear, the position of highest danger, defying the pursuing cavalry to come within range of his guns. He was alive, he was unhurt, and he was victorious. The screams of the dying men in Lawrence were a song that would play in his head for the rest of his short life, a melody that drowned out the memory of the crumbling jail in Kansas City. The debt was not fully paid, but the first large installment had been delivered with interest. The raid also cemented the divide between Anderson and Quantrill. While Quantrill had tried to maintain some semblance of military order, accepting surrenders and sparing the hotel guests, Anderson had operated with unrestrained savagery. Anderson viewed Quantrill's mercy as weakness. In Anderson's mind, there were no innocents in Lawrence. Every man who lived there was guilty by association. This ideological rift would widen in the coming months, but for now, they rode together, the architects of the worst atrocity of the war. As the sun began to set on August 21st, the guerrillas stopped to rest their horses near the banks of a creek. Anderson dismounted and walked to the water. He knelt and splashed the cool liquid on his face, watching the red swirls drift away in the current. He looked at his reflection in the water. The face staring back was harder, older, and emptier than it had been at dawn. He had crossed a threshold that morning. He had killed unarmed men, boys, and cripples. He had burned homes. He had become the thing the Union feared most, a man with no conscience. And as the darkness settled over the prairie, William Anderson smiled. The war was far from over. October 6, 1863 found the guerrilla column moving south through the Cherokee Neutral Lands, a desolate strip of territory bordering Kansas and the Indian nations. The high of the Lawrence raid had faded, replaced by the grim necessity of survival. Winter was approaching, and the Missouri foliage that provided their tactical cover was turning brittle and brown, stripping away their camouflage. William Quantrill led the procession of 400 men toward Texas, seeking the warmth and sanctuary of the Confederate lines. William Anderson rode near the front, his mood dark and volatile. The victory at Lawrence had not satiated him. It had only expanded his appetite for destruction. The column was moving toward a small Union fortification known as Baxter Springs, a lonely outpost intended to guard the military road. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry grass and horse sweat. As they neared the spring, the scouts reported a wagon train approaching from the north. It was the escort of Major General James G. Blunt, the commander of the Army of the Frontier, though the guerrillas did not yet know the identity of the prize. Blunt was moving his headquarters from Fort Scott to Fort Smith, traveling with a relatively light escort of 100 men and a military band. The guerrillas, many dressed in stolen blue uniforms from the Lawrence raid, formed a line of battle on the prairie. To the approaching Union troops, they appeared to be a welcoming detail from the fort, a fatal misidentification that Anderson watched with a cynical sneer. General Blunt, riding in a buggy, saw the line of men and assumed they were the garrison from Baxter Springs turning out to greet him. He ordered the regimental band to play a tune. The musicians, sitting in a large wagon, raised their brass instruments and began to play a lively air. The sound drifted across the open ground, surreal and discordant against the backdrop of the armed men waiting in silence. Anderson tightened his grip on his reins. He looked at the musicians, men who held horns instead of rifles, and saw only targets. The deception held until the distance closed to 200 yards. Then Quantrill gave the signal. The charge was instantaneous. The guerrillas spurred their horses, the line erupting into a full gallop. Anderson was among the first to break the formation, his horse tearing up the sod as he closed the distance. The Union escort, realizing too late that these were not friends, dissolved into panic. They fired a ragged, ineffective volley before the wave of horsemen crashed into them. Anderson rode straight for the bandwagon. The music died in a discordant shriek as the musicians realized their doom. They threw down their instruments and tried to scramble out of the wagon, but there was no escape. Anderson and his men encircled the wagon, firing point blank into the huddle of unarmed men. A drummer boy tried to crawl under the wheels. Anderson shot him in the back. A horn player raised his hands, pleading for quarter. Anderson put a ball through his face. The slaughter was absolute. The guerrillas did not just kill. They exterminated. They rode down the fleeing infantry, shooting them as they ran, trampling the wounded under the hooves of their mounts. The prairie grass was soon dotted with the blue-clad bodies of the escort and the musicians, their instruments gleaming strangely in the sun next to the carnage. General Blunt, exhibiting a desperate presence of mind, abandoned his buggy and mounted a fast horse, galloping away across the open plains. Anderson wanted to pursue, to mount the general's head on a pole, but the chaos of the massacre held him back. The men were looting the wagons, stripping the dead of boots, money, and weapons. Anderson dismounted near the bandwagon. He walked among the dead musicians, kicking a tuba aside to reach a fallen soldier. He checked the man for life, found none, and then turned his attention to the pockets. The plunder was rich. Fine, distinct liquors, gold watches, and high-quality revolvers. But Anderson was more interested in the violence itself. The massacre at Baxter Springs was a tactical victory, but a strategic dead end. They had missed the general, and the fort itself remained in Union hands, its garrison firing artillery at the guerrillas from behind the earthworks. Quantrill, realizing they could not take the fortified position without heavy artillery, ordered the column to move on. They left 80 Union dead on the field, many of them mutilated. Anderson rode away from the smoking wagons with a sense of frustration. The killing had been too easy, too quick. It lacked the terror of the house-to-house hunting in Lawrence. He wanted more resistance, more opportunity to inflict pain. The journey south through the Indian Territory was grueling. The weather turned against them, cold rain sleeting down, turning the trails into rivers of mud. Food was scarce. The men grumbled, their discipline fraying with every mile. Anderson kept to himself, or rode with his select group of killers, Archie Clement, Frank James, and a few others who shared his nihilistic worldview. They spoke little, their communication reduced to nods and gestures. They were becoming a wolf pack within the larger herd, bound by a shared addiction to bloodshed that even the other bushwhackers found unsettling. By November, the column crossed the Red River into Texas. They established a winter camp near Sherman, a rough frontier town that served as a supply hub for the Confederate forces in the region. The landscape was stark, red dirt and scrub oak, a different world from the lush river bottoms of Missouri. The arrival of Quantrill's command was met with mixed reactions by the Texans and the regular Confederate military. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were heavily armed brigands with a reputation for savagery. To Anderson, Texas was not a sanctuary, it was a cage. He hated the inactivity. He hated the Confederate officers who looked down on him with disdain, viewing him as a criminal rather than a patriot. The winter of 1863 in Sherman was characterized by a rapid disintegration of the guerrilla command structure. The external pressure of the Union Army was gone, replaced by internal friction. Quantrill, who had held the band together through the force of his personality and tactical brilliance, began to lose his grip. He spent his time with his mistress drinking and playing cards, seemingly content to rest on his laurels. Anderson viewed this lethargy with contempt. To him, the war did not stop because of the weather or the geography. The war was a constant state of being. Tensions flared over the distribution of loot and the behavior of the men in town. Anderson's faction, the most violent and uncontrollable, began to terrorize the local population. They robbed stores, insulted local women, and got into gunfights with the regular soldiers. Quantrill tried to rein them in, issuing orders for better conduct. Anderson ignored him. He saw Quantrill's attempts at discipline as a betrayal, a sign that the chief had gone soft. Anderson openly challenged Quantrill's authority in the camp, refusing to detail his men for guard duty or camp chores. "We are fighters," Anderson declared to a group of his followers. "We ain't camp servants for a man who wants to play general." The breaking point arrived with a specific incident involving the robbery of a local civilian. One of Anderson's men was accused of stealing a watch and a purse from a Sherman resident at gunpoint. Quantrill, under pressure from the Confederate General Henry McCulloch to police his men, ordered the man arrested and the property returned. Anderson intervened. He marched to Quantrill's tent, his hand resting on his revolver. The confrontation was public and heated. Anderson told Quantrill that he would not allow his men to be punished by a command that had grown fat and lazy. He accused Quantrill of caring more about the opinion of the Confederate brass than the welfare of the men who had bled for him. "You've gone soft, Quantrill," Anderson spat, his voice carrying through the quiet camp. "You sit here in your tent while the war waits. My men take what they need. That's the law of the brush. If you don't like it, come and take the watch back yourself." Quantrill looked at Anderson and saw the depth of the fracture. He realized that Anderson was no longer a lieutenant he could command. He was a rival chieftain with a growing following. Quantrill backed down, unwilling to spark a civil war within the camp that would result in dozens of dead guerrillas. He released the prisoner, but the damage was irreparable. The authority of the chieftain was shattered. Anderson walked away from the encounter with a swagger, knowing he had won. He had successfully defied the leader and proven that strength was the only rank that held meaning. Following this confrontation, the camp effectively split. Anderson moved his men to a separate location, distancing himself physically and ideologically from Quantrill. He began to recruit actively from the main body, drawing the most psychopathic and hardened killers to his banner. Men like Archie Clement, a diminutive sociopath who smiled while he scalped, gravitated toward Anderson. They preferred Anderson's total war doctrine to Quantrill's fading attempts at military legitimacy. Anderson promised them action. He promised them that when the grass grew in the spring, they would return to Missouri not as a unit of the Confederate Army, but as a plague. In December, Anderson married Bush Smith, a Sherman woman. The wedding was a surreal interlude in the violence. Anderson stood before the preacher, washed and dressed in his finest stolen clothes, pledging his troth to a woman he had known for only a short time. It was a bizarre attempt at normalcy, a mimicry of the life he might have had if the war had not destroyed his world. But even at his wedding, he was armed. His men stood guard, their eyes scanning the guests for threats. The domestic tranquility was a thin veneer. Within days of the ceremony, Anderson was back in the saddle, planning raids and honing the edge of his new company. The feud with Quantrill intensified as the winter dragged on. General McCulloch, the Confederate district commander, became increasingly frustrated with the guerrillas' lawlessness. He viewed them as a liability, a band of thieves hiding behind the Confederate flag. He summoned Quantrill and demanded he bring his men to heel. Quantrill, unable to control Anderson, admitted his lack of authority. This admission was the final nail in the coffin of the unified command. McCulloch ordered the arrest of the worst offenders. Anderson, anticipating the move, kept his men on high alert, ready to fight the Confederate regulars if they attempted to detain him. One night in January, a group of Anderson's men shot up a saloon in Sherman, killing a Confederate officer who had insulted them. The town was in an uproar. McCulloch issued a warrant for Anderson's arrest. Quantrill, trying to salvage the situation, advised Anderson to leave. Anderson laughed. He told Quantrill that he was leaving not because he was afraid of the warrant, but because he was done with Texas. He was done with the South. He was going back to Missouri with or without the spring grass. The departure was chaotic. Anderson gathered his 50 or so loyalists, the core of what would become the most feared band in the West. They packed their saddlebags with ammunition and dried meat. They checked their revolvers. They looked at the rest of the guerrilla force, the men who chose to stay with Quantrill or Todd, with disdain. Anderson rode to the edge of the camp and looked back. He saw Quantrill standing by a fire, a diminished figure. Anderson felt no nostalgia. He felt only the cold clarity of his purpose. He was now the captain of his own destiny, and that destiny was written in blood. The ride back toward the Red River was a defiant march. Anderson led his men north, away from the safety of the Confederate lines and back toward the killing fields. The separation from Quantrill liberated him. He no longer had to justify his actions or ask for permission. He could implement his own tactics, his own rules. The primary rule was simple: make the enemy fear the very air they breathed. He began to encourage his men to adopt more terrifying visual markers. They decorated their bridles with scalps, a practice that had been sporadic before but now became a unit standard. They wore ribbons and colorful shirts, turning themselves into grotesque caricatures of cavaliers. As they crossed into Indian territory again, heading north in the late winter chill, Anderson solidified the identity of his band. They were not soldiers, they were executioners. He spoke to them around the campfires, his voice low and intense. He told them that the spring of 1864 would be the season of the knife. He told them that they would ride deeper into Missouri than ever before. He told them that they would hunt the hunters. The massacre at Baxter Springs had been a prelude. The feud in Texas had been the refining fire. Now the weapon was forged. William Anderson was no longer just a participant in the war. He was an independent operator, a warlord of the brush. He carried the memory of his sister, the memory of Lawrence, and the memory of the dead musicians at Baxter Springs. These memories fueled a furnace of rage that would consume everything in its path. The winter landscape of the Indian nations was bleak, the trees bare skeletons against the gray sky. Anderson rode in silence, his mind working on the logistics of the coming campaign. He thought about the river crossings, the safe houses, the Union garrisons. He thought about the scalp hunters he was leading. He looked at Archie Clement, who was sharpening his knife, a blissful smile on his face. Anderson knew he had chosen well. These were the men who would follow him into the mouth of hell and laugh at the flames. By the time they reached the southern border of Missouri, the transformation was complete. The Bloody Bill legend was ready to be written in earnest. The constraints of the previous years were gone. There was no Judge Baker, no General Ewing, no William Quantrill to hold him back. There was only the open road, the heavy revolver on his hip, and the endless, insatiable need to kill. The year 1864 lay ahead, a blank page waiting for the red ink of Anderson's war. The gruesome mutilations that had been occasional were about to become systematic. The cruelty was about to go too far, and then it would go further still. April 1st, 1864, marked the return of the specter to the Missouri borderlands. The winter snows had melted into the swollen creeks, and the dogwood trees were beginning to flash white in the understory of the oak forests. William Anderson and his company of 50 picked men crossed the state line from the Arkansas Territory, riding north with a singular grim determination. They were not the same men who had ridden south the previous autumn. The exile in Texas, the feud with Quantrill, and the harsh winter living in the Cherokee lands had distilled the group down to its most violent essence. The stragglers, the moderates, and the men who fought for a political ideal had been left behind. What remained was a hardened nucleus of sociopathy, a cavalcade of young killers who viewed Anderson not just as a captain but as a prophet of total destruction. They moved through the southern counties of Missouri like a contagion, avoiding the large Union garrisons and preying on isolated patrols and federal foragers. Anderson rode at the head of the column, his appearance now fully evolved into the terrifying persona that would haunt the region for generations. He wore a guerrilla shirt of dark wool heavily embroidered with colored thread, a wide-brimmed hat with a plume, and 4 revolvers strapped to his waist and saddle. His hair fell to his shoulders in greasy dark waves, framing a face that had lost all capacity for mercy. He did not speak of the Confederacy anymore. He spoke of the work, a euphemism for the systematic extermination of Unionists. As they pushed deeper into the state, navigating the familiar terrain of the Snaya Bar and the Blackwater, Anderson began to recruit. He did not look for soldiers. He looked for boys who had been broken by the war. He found them in the burnt-out farmhouses and the refugee camps of the border. These were teenagers, 16 and 17 years old, whose fathers had been hanged by jayhawkers or whose mothers had been insulted by militia. They were filled with an incoherent rage that Anderson harnessed and directed. He handed them revolvers, taught them how to shoot from a galloping horse, and gave them permission to unleash their darkest impulses. Among these new recruits and hardened veterans, one figure rose to prominence as Anderson's right hand, Archie Clement. Small, blonde, and perpetually smiling, Clement was a teenager with the mind of a predator. He was 18 years old, but his boyish face belied a terrifying proficiency with a knife. Anderson saw in Clement a reflection of his own void. Clement did not kill out of duty, he killed because he enjoyed the mechanics of it. He treated violence as a sport, a pastime to be savored. Anderson promoted him to lieutenant, signaling to the rest of the band that cruelty was the metric for advancement. In late May of 1864, the band crossed the Missouri River, moving into the counties north of the waterway. This was a strategic shift. The southern counties had been picked clean, the forage was scarce, and the Union presence was heavy. The north, counties like Boone, Howard, Randolph, and Carroll, was rich, relatively untouched, and defended mostly by local militia units who were ill-equipped to deal with veteran guerrillas. The crossing was a logistical challenge involving stolen skiffs and swimming horses across the muddy, churning current under the cover of darkness. When they emerged on the northern bank, they were entering a new hunting ground, a land of plenty where they could inflict maximum terror. The transition to scalping as a standard operating procedure began in earnest during the first weeks of June 1864. It was not a sudden order, but a gradual escalation of atrocities sanctioned by Anderson. In a skirmish near the wooded breaks of the Chariton River, the band ambushed a small patrol of federal militia. The fight was short and brutal. The militia, terrified by the sudden onslaught of screaming horsemen, fired a few wild shots and broke. Anderson's men rode them down, shooting them from the saddle. When the firing stopped, 5 Union soldiers lay dead in the tall grass. Anderson walked among the bodies, his boots crunching on the dry vegetation. He watched as Archie Clement knelt beside a dead sergeant. Clement pulled a large Bowie knife from his belt, the blade gleaming in the afternoon sun. With a practiced, fluid motion, Clement grabbed the soldier's hair and made a circular incision around the crown of the head. He braced his foot against the corpse's shoulder and pulled. The sound was a wet, tearing noise like canvas ripping. Clement held the bloody trophy up, shaking it to remove the loose gore. He smiled at Anderson, his eyes bright with excitement. Anderson did not reprimand him. He nodded. Ideally, he realized, this was the ultimate psychological weapon. A dead soldier was a statistic, a mutilated soldier was a message. From that day forward, the scalping became policy. It spread through the company like a fever. The men began to compete for the best trophies. They tied the bloody patches of hair to their bridle bits, allowing them to dangle and rot in the summer heat. They wove them into the manes of their horses. The visual impact was horrific. When they rode into a town or charged a Union line, the enemy saw not just armed men but demons decorated with the remains of their comrades. The flies swarmed around the horses' heads, drawn by the scent of decaying flesh, adding a buzzing, nauseating soundtrack to their movements. The violence in the northern counties escalated rapidly throughout June. Anderson's strategy was to paralyze the local Union infrastructure through sheer terror. He targeted the enrolled Missouri militia, local men who had taken up arms to defend their communities. To Anderson, these men were traitors, neighbors killing neighbors, and they deserved a fate worse than the regular army. On June 12, 1864, near Kingsville, the band encountered a scouting party. The guerrillas feigned a retreat, drawing the militia into a trap. When the Union soldiers rode into the kill zone, Anderson signaled the turn. The guerrillas wheeled their horses and charged, the revolver charge that was their trademark. The militiamen were overwhelmed by the volume of fire. The guerrillas carried 4 to 6 revolvers each, allowing them to put dozens of rounds into the air without reloading. The Union soldiers, armed with single-shot muskets or slow-loading carbines, were cut to pieces. Those who survived the initial volley were hunted down. One militia private, a boy of 19, threw down his weapon and raised his hands. A guerrilla rode up to him and shot him through the neck. As the boy choked on his own blood, the guerrilla dismounted and took his scalp before he had even stopped breathing. The brutality was rushed, frantic, fueled by the adrenaline of the charge. Anderson presided over these massacres with a cold, detached authority. He did not participate in the scalping himself as often as Clement, but he encouraged it. He understood that the mutilation dehumanized the enemy in the eyes of his own men. If the Union soldiers were merely livestock to be skinned, then killing them required no moral calculation. This desensitization was necessary to maintain the intensity of violence he required. He wanted his men to be incapable of empathy. He wanted them to look at a pleading man and see only an object. The environment of the Missouri summer contributed to the horror. The heat in June 1864 was oppressive, the air thick with humidity and the smell of ozone. The vegetation was dense, providing perfect ambush sites along every road and creek bed. The guerrillas lived in this green labyrinth, sleeping during the heat of the day and riding at night. They moved like ghosts, striking a farmhouse or a depot and vanishing before the alarm could be raised. The local Union commanders were baffled. They would receive a report of Anderson in one county, and by the time they deployed troops, he was 30 miles away, leaving a trail of smoking ruins and headless bodies. In the middle of June, the band raided a small settlement in Carroll County. They didn't just target the military, they targeted the psychological safety of the civilians. They rode into the town square at midday, firing into the air, screaming the rebel yell. They rounded up the male inhabitants, checking their names against a list of known Union sympathizers Anderson carried. 3 men were identified as having provided information to federal troops. Anderson ordered them executed in the street. As their wives and children watched, the men were shot down. Then, at a nod from Anderson, Clement and another guerrilla stepped forward and scalped the corpses in full view of the townspeople. The screams of the women echoed off the buildings, a sound that Anderson absorbed without flinching. He told the sobbing crowd that this was the price of loyalty to the Union. The raids were not just about killing, they were about supply. The band needed fresh horses, ammunition, and food. They took what they wanted at gunpoint. If a farmer resisted, his barn was burned. If he complained, he was shot. The horses they stole were the best in the county, chosen for speed and endurance. Anderson insisted on mounting his men on superior animals. A guerrilla's life depended on his ability to outrun the heavy Union cavalry. They swapped horses frequently, riding them into the ground, and then seizing fresh mounts from the next farm. This constant mobility made them impossible to catch. By late June, the reputation of Anderson's band had morphed into folklore. The newspapers, both Union and Confederate, began to print stories of the scalp hunters. They described Anderson as a devil, a man who drank blood and worshipped death. These stories, while exaggerated, served Anderson's purpose. Fear was a force multiplier. Militia units began to refuse orders to patrol the woods, terrified of falling into the hands of the knife-wielding teenagers. Entire towns went into lockdown when a rumor circulated that Anderson was nearby. The psychological victory was being won before the shots were even fired. The internal dynamic of the group solidified into a death cult. The men stopped shaving and washing regularly. They wore their hair long, mimicking their captain. They wore the stolen uniforms of federal officers, often riddled with bullet holes and stained with blood. They communicated in a shorthand of violence, laughing at the gruesome details of the day's work around the campfire. Anderson sat among them, sharpening his knife, listening to the reports. He validated their atrocities. He told them that they were the hand of God punishing the wicked. He twisted religion and patriotism into a justification for sadism. One particular incident in late June illustrated the total abandonment of civilized norms. A federal dispatch rider was captured near the Wakenda Creek. The man was carrying letters from soldiers to their families. Anderson read the letters aloud to his men, mocking the sentiments of love and longing. When he finished, he ordered the rider stripped naked. They tied him to a tree and used him for target practice, seeing how close they could shoot without killing him. The man screamed for an hour as the bullets tore the bark inches from his skin. Finally, bored with the game, Anderson walked up and shot him in the heart. The body was left tied to the tree, scalped and mutilated, a grotesque signpost for the next patrol to find. The weaponry of the band also evolved. Anderson realized that the revolver was the supreme weapon of the brush war. He required every man to carry at least 4. They spent their idle hours molding lead balls and measuring powder charges. They practiced reloading cylinders on the move. They modified their holsters for faster draws. A man with 6 revolvers was a walking battery of artillery. In a close-range fight, a group of 20 guerrillas could unleash over 100 rounds in seconds. This volume of fire was overwhelming against troops armed with single-shot muskets. They didn't aim. They pointed and flooded the air with lead. As June 1864 drew to a close, Anderson's band had effectively severed Union control over a large swath of North Missouri. The railroads were under constant threat, the telegraph lines were cut repeatedly, and the mail stopped running. The Union commanders, Generals Clinton Fisk and Egbert Brown, were frantic. They issued orders to hunt Anderson down, to show no quarter, to exterminate the gang like vermin. But they couldn't find him. He was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom who struck from the cornfields and vanished into the timber. The transformation of the war was absolute. It was no longer a conflict of maneuver and strategy. It was a war of extermination. The scalp on the bridle bit was the symbol of the new reality. Anderson had proved that cruelty had no bottom. He had taken the violence of the frontier, the brutality of the Indian Wars, and the hatred of the civil conflict, and fused them into a weapon of terrifying power. The gruesome mutilations were not random acts of madness. They were a calculated tactic designed to break the will of the enemy. The men riding with Anderson had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were no longer fighting for a cause that could be negotiated at a peace table. They were fighting for their lives, knowing that capture meant a rope. This desperation made them fearless. They attacked odds that were suicidal, charging into the teeth of Union fire with a reckless abandon that stunned the federal troops. They knew they were damned, and they intended to take as many bluecoats with them to hell as possible. Anderson looked at his men on the last day of June, 1864. They were camped in a dense thicket of hickory and oak. The horses were tethered, munching on corn stolen from a nearby field. The men were cleaning their guns, the click of the cylinders a rhythmic percussion in the humid air. Fresh scalps dried on the saddle horns, attracting flies. Anderson felt a grim satisfaction. He had built a machine of death. The summer was just beginning, and he had big plans. The railroads were waiting. The towns were waiting. The slaughter would continue until the rivers ran red or until the last of them was dead. The rise of the scalp hunters was complete. Now came the reign of terror. July 1st, 1864, descended upon the counties north of the Missouri River with an oppressive, stifling weight. The sun blazed down from a cloudless, pale blue sky, baking the rich alluvial soil until it cracked and turned to fine, choking dust. The corn in the fields of Boone, Howard, and Randolph counties stood tall and rigid, forming green canyons that trapped the heat and provided an impenetrable screen for the predators moving within them. William Anderson and his band of guerrillas had ceased to be a mere nuisance to the federal authorities. They had become the undisputed masters of the region. The Union garrisons, huddled behind their fortifications in the larger towns, had effectively ceded control of the countryside. The roads, the trails, and the river crossings belonged to Anderson. The terror was no longer sporadic. It was atmospheric, hanging over the land like the humidity that drenched the shirts of the farmers who dared to work their fields. The operational tempo of the guerrilla band shifted in July. They were no longer running. They were hunting. The band had swollen in size, attracting recruits from every corner of the district. Deserters, angry farm boys, and men seeking the protection of the strongest warlord in the territory. Anderson moved this growing army with a frantic energy. On the 10th of July, they swept through the Chariton River bottoms, a chaotic cavalcade of heavily armed horsemen. The horses, the finest thoroughbreds stolen from the wealthiest stables in Missouri, were pushed to their limits, their coats foaming with sweat as they galloped from one engagement to the next. Anderson rode at the front, his face a mask of grime and sunburn, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for the dust cloud of a federal patrol. On the 15th of July, 1864, Anderson targeted the town of Huntsville, the county seat of Randolph County. This was not a stealthy ambush, it was a brazen assertion of dominance. The guerrillas rode into the town in broad daylight, their revolvers drawn, screaming the rebel yell that froze the blood of the inhabitants. The citizens of Huntsville, seeing the ribbon-bedecked riders and the scalps drying on the bridles, fled into their homes or cellars. Anderson dismounted in front of the county administrative building, his spurs jingling on the wooden boardwalk. He did not look like a soldier. He looked like a wealthy, eccentric prince of bandits. He wore a velvet shirt, high cavalry boots, and a hat adorned with a swaying ostrich plume. The objective was the county treasury and the local bank. Anderson's men smashed their way into the buildings, using the butts of their carbines and heavy stones to splinter the doors. The robbery was conducted with a terrifying efficiency. They terrified the clerks, pressing the cold muzzles of their Navy Colts against trembling foreheads, demanding the keys to the safes. They swept roughly $40,000 into grain sacks, greenbacks, gold coin, and bonds. But the robbery was secondary to the violence. A local citizen, an older man who made the mistake of protesting the theft, was struck down. One of Anderson's lieutenants, likely Clement, stepped up to the man and fired a ball into his stomach. The man collapsed on the floor of the bank, clutching his gut, while the guerrillas stepped over him to continue looting. They did not finish him off immediately. They let him groan, his pain serving as a soundtrack to their theft. Following the raid on Huntsville, the paralysis of the region deepened. The Union commander of the district, General Clinton Fisk, sat in his headquarters in St. Joseph reading report after report of Anderson's movements. Fisk was a capable administrator, but he was fighting a ghost. Every time he dispatched a column of cavalry to intercept the guerrillas, Anderson was gone, vanished into the thickets of the Perch Hills or the deep woods of Carroll County. The federal troops, mounted on inferior government-issue horses, could not close the distance. They found only the aftermath: cut telegraph wires coiling like dead snakes on the ground, burned railroad depots, and the bodies of Union sympathizers left rotting in the sun. The violence against the civilian infrastructure escalated throughout late July. Anderson understood that the railroad was the lifeline of the Union Army. He ordered his men to destroy it wherever they found it. They didn't just tear up the tracks. They waged war on the machinery itself. Near the town of Rennick, they ambushed a work crew repairing the line. The laborers, unarmed civilians, scattered into the brush. Anderson's men rode them down for sport. They shot them in the legs to slow them down, then circled back to deliver the fatal shots. They piled railroad ties onto the tracks and set them afire, the creosote-soaked wood burning with a thick black smoke that could be seen for miles. When a train approached, and the engineer saw the obstruction, he reversed the engine, fleeing backward toward the safety of the nearest garrison, carrying the news that the line was severed. The river was not safe either. The Missouri River, the great artery of commerce, became a gauntlet. Anderson posted sharpshooters on the bluffs overlooking the water. When a steamboat chugged into view, struggling against the muddy current, the guerrillas opened fire. They targeted the pilot house, trying to kill the captain and run the boat aground. The passengers, huddled on the decks or in the cabins, lay flat on the floorboards as balls smashed through the thin wooden walls and shattered the glass windows. The sound of the heavy-caliber slugs hitting the boat sounded like hammer strikes. On one occasion, a boat captain, terrified by the volume of fire, waved a white sheet from the deck. Anderson ordered his men to cease firing, but he did not allow the boat to dock. He simply wanted to see them beg. He waved them on, laughing as the vessel limped away, riddled with holes. August arrived, bringing no relief from the heat or the bloodshed. The atmosphere in the counties of North Missouri was one of apocalyptic dread. The Paw Paw Militia, a local defense force organized by the Union and composed largely of men with Southern sympathies, began to defect en masse. They looked at the situation and made a calculated choice. The Union could not protect them, but Anderson could kill them. Entire companies of militia surrendered their arms to the guerrillas without firing a shot. In some cases, they handed over their Enfields and revolvers and then joined Anderson's ranks, trading their blue armbands for the chaotic uniform of the bushwhacker. This influx of weapons and men made Anderson more dangerous than ever. He was now commanding a force that rivaled a regular Confederate regiment in firepower, if not in discipline. In the second week of August, near the town of Fredericksburg in Ray County, the brutality reached a new low. A small patrol of Federal soldiers, separated from their main column, was captured by Anderson's vanguard. There were 6 men. They were stripped of their weapons and horses and forced to march barefoot over the sharp limestone rocks of a creek bed. Anderson rode alongside them, mocking their discomfort. When they reached a clearing, he halted the column. He did not shoot them immediately. He ordered them to kneel. He walked down the line, asking each man where he was from. When one soldier replied that he was from Iowa, Anderson pistol-whipped him, splitting the skin on his cheekbone. "You came a long way to die," Anderson told him. At a signal, the guerrillas opened fire. The volley was ragged, tearing into the kneeling men. Bodies jerked under the impact of the heavy slugs. One man, hit in the shoulder, tried to scramble away on his hands and knees. Archie Clement walked over to him, grabbed him by the hair, and slit his throat with a swift, brutal motion. The blood sprayed across the dry grass, turning black in the dust. The bodies were not buried. They were left where they fell, food for the buzzards that were constantly circling Anderson's column. The psychological toll on the Union soldiers tasked with hunting Anderson was immense. They were riding into a land where every tree line could hide an ambush, where the local population was either hostile or too terrified to help, and where capture meant torture and death. Patrols moved with extreme caution, often refusing to enter the deep woods. This caution allowed Anderson to operate with near impunity. He established a base of operations in the Blackfoot region of Boone County, a rugged area of hills and ravines that was virtually impenetrable to regular cavalry. Here, the guerrillas rested, shod their horses, and planned their next atrocities. The camp in the Blackfoot Hills was a scene from a nightmare. The heat was sweltering, the air thick with mosquitoes and horseflies. The men slept on the ground, their heads resting on their saddles. The smell of the camp was a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, horse manure, and the sweet, sickly scent of the drying scalps that many men still carried. Anderson moved through the camp like a dark wraith. He did not fraternize with the men in the way a normal officer would. He was aloof, his mind occupied with the logistics of slaughter. He spent hours cleaning his guns, disassembling the mechanisms, oiling the springs, and reassembling them. He tested the actions over and over, the click, click, click of the cylinder rotation serving as his only conversation. In mid-August, Anderson received word that a prominent Union man in Rocheport had been speaking out against the guerrillas, calling them cowards and thieves. Anderson took a dozen men and rode to the town. They arrived at dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the streets. They rode straight to the man's house. He was eating dinner with his family. The guerrillas kicked in the door, dragging the man out into the yard. His wife screamed, clinging to his arm, but they beat her back with the butts of their pistols. They did not shoot the man. Anderson wanted to make an example. They tied a rope around his neck and dragged him behind a horse down the main street of Rocheport. The man's body bounced and tore against the rough dirt and rocks. When they finally stopped, he was dead, his body a ruin of abrasions and broken bones. Anderson cut the rope and left the corpse in the middle of the road. "Let the dogs have him," he said to the horrified onlookers who peered from their windows. The fear was so absolute that farmers stopped bringing their crops to market. The roads were empty of travelers. The mail service ceased entirely. The telegraph lines were cut so often that the operators gave up trying to repair them. North Missouri was effectively cut off from the rest of the world, isolated in a bubble of violence. Anderson was the law, the judge, and the executioner. He levied taxes on the towns, demanding payments in gold or supplies in exchange for not burning them to the ground. The mayors and councils paid, handing over the money with shaking hands, grateful to escape with their lives. Toward the end of August, the band moved east toward the river counties again. The heat had broken slightly, giving way to the heavy static air of late summer storms. Thunder rumbled in the distance, matching the rumble of the hooves. The numbers in the band had grown to nearly 300 men. It was a formidable force, heavily armed and mounted on the best horses in the state. They were confident, borderline arrogant. They had met the Union Army in dozens of skirmishes and had won every time. They believed they were invincible. On August 27th, they struck a federal supply train near Fayette. The wagons were guarded by a company of infantry. Anderson did not hesitate. He ordered a charge. The guerrillas hit the line of wagons like a thunderbolt. The infantry, caught in the open, tried to form a defensive square, but the volume of fire from the guerrillas broke them. The soldiers broke rank and ran for the timber. Anderson's men pursued them, riding them down. One soldier, cornered against a creek bank, turned to fight with his bayonet. Anderson rode straight at him, deflecting the thrust with the barrel of his pistol and shooting the man in the face. The wagons were looted and burned. The smoke rose in a black column, another signal fire marking Anderson's passage. The sheer scale of the violence in August 1864 forced the Union command to acknowledge that they were facing a major uprising. General Rosecrans, the department commander, declared that the situation in North Missouri was critical. He authorized the arming of more local militias, a move that backfired as more weapons fell into Anderson's hands. The Summer of Terror had revealed the fragility of Union control. A single man, driven by a pathological need for vengeance, had brought the entire military district to its knees. Anderson, however, was not satisfied. The skirmishes, the robberies, the individual killings, they were just maintenance. He wanted something bigger. He wanted a victory that would shake the foundations of the Union presence in the West. As August turned to September, his gaze turned toward the railroad lines again. He began to plan a strike that would combine all the elements of his warfare. The disruption of transport, the humiliation of the army, and the mass slaughter of soldiers. He looked at the map, tracing the line of the North Missouri Railroad. His finger stopped at a small station in Boone County. The mood in the guerrilla camp shifted as August waned. The casual brutality of the summer hardened into a focused, deadly intent. The men sensed that Anderson was preparing for a grand finale to the season. They sharpened their knives. They cast thousands of lead balls over the campfires. They groomed their horses, checking hooves and tendons. They were a well-oiled machine of destruction, waiting for the operator to pull the lever. On the last day of August, Anderson rode to the top of a ridge overlooking the Missouri River. The water was low, exposing the sandbars. He looked south toward the land where his father had been killed, toward the land where his sisters had died. The rage was still there, burning as hot as ever, but it was controlled now, channeled into a cold, strategic vision. He turned his horse back toward the north, toward the railroad tracks that cut through the prairie. The summer was over, the harvest was approaching, and William Anderson intended to reap a crop of death that would be remembered forever. The sun set on August 31st, casting a blood-red glow across the clouds. In the darkening woods, the guerrillas mounted up. The crickets began their nightly chorus, soon to be drowned out by the thud of hoofbeats. The terror of the summer was merely the prologue. The true horror, the event that would define the limits of human cruelty in the Civil War, was waiting just over the horizon in the month of September. Anderson spurred his horse, leading his demons into the night, leaving a silence behind him that was heavy with the promise of the grave. September 27th, 1864, began with a deceptive calm over the flat, high prairie surrounding the hamlet of Centralia, Missouri. The sun rose into a clear, crisp autumn sky, illuminating a desolate landscape of dry grass and scattered cornfields. Centralia itself was barely a town, a solitary collection of 24 wooden structures huddled around the tracks of the North Missouri Railroad. It was a place of transit, a depot where the lifeline of the Union supply chain intersected with the emptiness of the plains. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the prairie was shattered by the thunder of 80 horses as William Anderson and his company rode out of the timber and descended upon the settlement. They did not charge with the rebel yell this time. They trotted in with the casual arrogance of men who owned the ground beneath their hooves. The occupation of the town was methodical and immediate. Anderson, wearing a black velvet shirt heavily embroidered, with colored silk and a hat adorned with a sweeping ostrich plume, signaled his men to disperse. They blocked the roads leading in and out of the village, effectively sealing the perimeter. A detachment rode straight to the railroad depot, dismounting and storming the office. The telegraph operator, seeing the rough men with their multiple revolvers and long, greasy hair, surrendered his station without a word. The guerrillas tore the apparatus from the table, smashing the keys and severing the copper wires, cutting Centralia off from the outside world. The isolation was complete. For the next hour, the town was subjected to a spree of looting that was both terrifying and bizarre. The guerrillas broke into the two general stores, smashing glass counters and sweeping goods into pillowcases and grain sacks. They took boots, hats, and bolts of cloth, but their primary interest was whiskey. They rolled barrels into the dusty street, knocking in the heads and drinking from tin cups or directly from the bung. Anderson did not participate in the drunken revelry. He stalked the wooden boardwalks, his spurs chiming on the planks, his eyes fixed on the southern horizon where the railroad tracks vanished into the distance. He was waiting. Around 11 o'clock, the stagecoach from Columbia arrived, rumbling into town unaware of the occupation. The driver pulled the team to a halt in front of the hotel, only to be surrounded instantly by a swarm of laughing, intoxicated gunmen. The passengers were dragged from the coach. Among them was James S. Rollins, a prominent congressman and unionist, who managed to hide his identity by giving a false name and claiming to be a simple farmer. The guerrillas stripped the passengers of their wallets and watches, taking a particular pleasure in humiliating the well-dressed travelers. They slashed the leather luggage, scattering clothes and personal papers into the dirt. Anderson watched the robbery with a detached amusement, but his attention snapped back to the railroad tracks when a whistle blew in the distance. The train was coming. It was the regular mail and passenger service from St. Charles moving north toward Macon. Anderson shouted orders, his voice cutting through the drunken noise of his men. The guerrillas scrambled to the tracks. They dragged heavy wooden railroad ties, old fence posts, and loose debris onto the iron rails, building a hasty barricade just south of the depot. They lined up along the sides of the track, hiding behind the depot building and the piles of lumber, their revolvers drawn and cocked. The train approached slowly, the engineer, James Clark, reducing speed as he prepared to stop at the station. As the engine rounded the final curve, Clark saw the obstruction on the tracks and the armed men swarming the platform. He slammed on the brakes, the iron wheels screeching and throwing sparks against the rails as the heavy locomotive slid to a halt just feet from the barricade. The steam hissed violently from the relief valves, masking the initial shouts of the attackers. The guerrillas broke cover, rushing the cars, firing their pistols into the air and shattering the glass windows of the passenger coaches. Panic erupted inside the train. Women screamed and children cried as the rough, bearded faces of the bushwhackers appeared at the windows. Anderson swung himself onto the platform of the first passenger car, kicking open the door. He marched down the aisle, a revolver in each hand, ordering everyone out. The passengers stumbled out of the cars, hands raised, terrified by the sudden transition from a mundane journey to a life-or-death confrontation. They were herded onto the depot platform, a huddled mass of civilians surrounded by the heavily armed gang. It was then that Anderson discovered the prize he had been hoping for. Scattered among the civilians in the passenger cars were 23 Union soldiers. These were not combat troops on their way to the front. They were furloughed men, veterans of the 1st Iowa Cavalry and other units returning home after fighting in Sherman's Atlanta campaign. They were unarmed, their weapons left behind or checked in baggage, and they wore the worn, faded blue uniforms of men who had seen hard service. They had survived the battles of the Deep South only to ride into a trap in a Missouri backwater. Anderson's eyes narrowed as he looked at the blue uniforms. He ordered the soldiers separated from the civilians. The guerrillas moved in, shoving the Union men with the barrels of their guns, forcing them to form a line along the railroad tracks. The civilians were pushed back against the depot wall, warned to stay silent or be shot. The soldiers stood in a ragged row, 23 men facing 80 killers. They looked at Anderson, seeing the dead eyes and the cruel set of his mouth, and they understood that their furlough had just been canceled. The guerrillas began to strip the soldiers. Anderson wanted them humiliated before they died. He ordered them to remove their blue coats and their boots. The soldiers complied, their movements slow and stiff. They were surrounded by jeering bushwhackers who poked them with knives and insulted their regiments. One guerrilla grabbed a soldier's hat and placed it on his own head, dancing a mock jig. Another ripped the buttons from a soldier's tunic, pocketing them as souvenirs. The soldiers stood in their shirt sleeves and socks, shivering slightly in the cool autumn breeze, stripped of their military identity but retaining a grim, silent dignity. Anderson walked down the line, inspecting his catch. He stopped in front of a young private, looking him up and down with a sneer. He asked the man where he had served. The private replied that he had been with Sherman. Anderson nodded, as if this confirmed a private judgment. He hated Sherman's army with a specific venomous intensity. These men were the destroyers of the South, the burners of Atlanta. To Anderson, they were not prisoners of war. They were criminals who had been caught at the scene of the crime. He reached the end of the line and turned to face the group. "Is there an officer among you?" he asked, his voice flat and carrying easily over the wind. "Or a non-commissioned officer?" For a moment there was silence. Then a man stepped forward. It was Sergeant Thomas Goodman of the 1st Missouri Engineers. He stood at attention, looking Anderson in the eye. "I am a sergeant," Goodman stated. Anderson looked at Goodman, studying him. Perhaps he saw a use for a prisoner to exchange, or perhaps it was a momentary whim of respect for a man who would step forward to meet his death. Anderson pointed a gloved finger at Goodman. "Step out," he ordered. Two guerrillas grabbed Goodman by the arms and dragged him away from the line, shoving him toward the group of civilians. Goodman looked back at his comrades, his face pale, realizing he had just been spared, for reasons he could not comprehend. The remaining 22 soldiers stood alone on the tracks. They knew what was coming. Some of them began to pray, their lips moving silently. Others stared straight ahead, refusing to give their executioners the satisfaction of seeing fear. Anderson turned to his trusted lieutenant, Archie Clement. Clement, the 18-year-old sociopath known as Little Archie, was standing with a smile on his face, a Colt Navy revolver in each hand. "Archie," Anderson said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Mustering out." The order was the catalyst for the slaughter. Clement raised his pistols and fired the first shots. The man standing at the left of the line took a ball in the forehead and dropped backward onto the gravel ballast. The other guerrillas joined in immediately. It was not a disciplined firing squad volley. It was a chaotic, rolling fusillade of pistol fire. The air filled with the sharp cracks of the revolvers and the smell of sulfurous smoke. The soldiers fell in a heap. The heavy 54 caliber balls and 36 caliber slugs tore through their bodies at close range. Men were hit in the chest, the stomach, and the face. The impact of the rounds knocked them off their feet, spinning them around or slamming them into the ground. There was no cover, no way to fight back. It was simple, industrial butchery. Within 10 seconds, the line of standing men had become a pile of bleeding corpses and writhing wounded. The firing did not stop when the men fell. Anderson watched as his men walked up to the bodies. They fired into the pile, ensuring that no one was feigning death. The sound of the shots was punctuated by the dull thud of bullets hitting dead flesh. One soldier, shot through the hip, tried to crawl under the wheels of the train. A guerrilla walked over, placed the muzzle of his pistol against the back of the man's head, and pulled the trigger. The man's body went limp, sliding down the embankment. The brutality intensified as the shooting tapered off. The guerrillas, fueled by whiskey and bloodlust, began to mutilate the dead. Clement, never satisfied with mere killing, drew his knife. He knelt beside the body of a corporal and began the gruesome work of removing the scalp. Other guerrillas followed suit, laughing as they collected their trophies. They moved among the dead like scavengers, cutting buttons from shirts, taking rings from fingers, and rifling through pockets for letters and money. The civilians on the platform watched in horror, many of them weeping or turning away to vomit. Anderson stood amidst the carnage, reloading his revolvers. He did not touch the bodies himself. He let his men do the dirty work. He looked at the pile of blue-clad men and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was the war he wanted to fight. No maneuvering, no politics, just the absolute destruction of the enemy. He walked over to where Sergeant Goodman was being held. He looked at the survivor, his expression unreadable. Goodman met his gaze, shaking slightly from the shock of witnessing the massacre of his friends. Anderson said nothing to him, simply turning away to survey the town. The train itself was the next victim. Anderson ordered the engineer and the fireman to uncouple the locomotive from the passenger cars. He wanted to send the engine running wild down the track to cause a wreck further down the line. But the mechanism was damaged in the confusion. Instead, he ordered the train destroyed. The guerrillas went into the baggage car and the passenger coaches, smashing the lamps and piling combustible material on the seats. They set fire to the upholstery and the wood paneling. The dry wood of the train cars caught fire quickly. Flames licked up the sides of the coaches, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. The heat became intense, forcing the guerrillas and the civilians back from the tracks. The roar of the fire mixed with the crackling of the burning timber. The locomotive, still under steam, hissed and groaned as the fire engulfed the tender. The destruction of the train was a symbolic act, a rejection of the industrial power of the North. Anderson watched the flames consume the symbol of Union progress, his face illuminated by the orange glow. While the train burned, the guerrillas finished looting the depot. They found a shipment of boots intended for the army and distributed them among themselves, discarding their old, worn footwear on the platform next to the dead bodies. They broke into the express car safe, taking thousands of dollars in greenbacks. The wealth of the robbery was staggering, but to Anderson, it was merely fuel for the next campaign. He didn't care about the money. He cared about the capacity to keep moving and killing. The sun climbed to its zenith, shining down on a scene of absolute hell. The town of Centralia was wrecked. The stores were gutted. The train was a burning pyre, and 22 men lay dead on the tracks, their blood pooling in the gravel and turning black in the heat. The smell of blood, burning wood, and gunpowder hung heavy in the air, a sickening miasma that coated the back of the throat. The civilians were finally told to disperse, to run for their homes or the open prairie. They scattered like frightened quail, desperate to put distance between themselves and the monsters at the depot. Anderson remounted his horse, a magnificent bay mare he had stolen weeks prior. He signaled his men to gather. They mounted up, their saddlebags bulging with loot, fresh scalps dripping from their bridles. They were loud, boastful, drunk on violence and liquor. They cheered Anderson, calling his name, praising the slaughter. Anderson did not smile. He looked at the burning train one last time, then turned his horse toward the east. He knew that the smoke from the burning train would be seen for miles. He knew that the telegraph lines being down would confuse the Union command for a few hours, but eventually troops would come. Major A.V.E. Johnston and the 39th Missouri Infantry were known to be in the area. Anderson was not fleeing. He was repositioning. He intended to lure the Federals into a fight on his own terms. The massacre at the station was just the bait. As the column rode out of Centralia, leaving the 22 mutilated bodies baking in the sun, Anderson rode beside Sergeant Goodman. He told the sergeant to keep up or he would be dragged. Goodman, riding a mule provided by the guerrillas, struggled to stay mounted. He looked back at the station where the smoke was rising in a thick black column. He saw the bodies of the men he had served with, men who had talked about their wives and children just hours before, now reduced to meat on the tracks. The morning of September 27th had been a masterclass in terror. Anderson had demonstrated that no place was safe, that the railroad could not protect them, and that surrender was a death sentence. The brutality was calculated to send a message to every Union soldier in Missouri: go home or die like a dog. The guerrillas rode toward a campsite near Singletary's farm, a few miles from town, to feed their horses and rest. They believed the day's work was done. They did not know that the afternoon would bring an even greater harvest of death. Anderson halted the column at the edge of the woods. He looked back at the town, now a smudge on the horizon. The execution of the furloughed soldiers had been personal. It was an act of purification, cleansing the land of the federal presence. He felt the familiar weight of the silk cord in his pocket, touching the new knots he would need to tie. 22 knots. It was a good morning's work. But as he turned his face to the wind, he smelled the approach of more prey. The 39th Missouri was closing in, and Anderson's appetite was far from sated. The stage was set for the second act of the tragedy, and the grass of Young's Creek was waiting to be watered with blood. 3 o'clock in the afternoon on September 27, 1864, brought a shifting of the wind over the high prairie of Boone County. The thick, oily column of smoke from the burning train at Centralia had begun to disperse, drifting southward like a grim signal flare, but the scent of charred wood and roasted meat remained heavy in the air. Major A.V.E. Johnston, commanding the mounted infantry of the 39th Missouri, rode into the devastation of the depot with a face set in rigid, trembling anger. He looked down from his saddle at the 22 stripped and bullet-riddled bodies of the furloughed soldiers lying on the tracks. The flies had already found the wounds, swarming in black clouds over the congealed blood. Johnston was a man of the Union, a believer in order and the rules of engagement, and what lay before him was a violation of every martial code he understood. He did not see a tactical trap. He saw a crime scene that demanded immediate, violent retribution. The citizens of Centralia, still shell-shocked and hiding in the debris of their looted homes, emerged cautiously to warn the major. They told him that Anderson was not alone. They whispered that the guerrilla force was massive, perhaps numbering 300 or 400 men, far more than the 80 riders who had sacked the town. They told him that heavily armed men like George Todd and David Poole had joined Anderson in the timber. Johnston dismissed the intelligence with a wave of his gauntlet. He looked at his own men, roughly 150 mounted infantry armed with long Enfield muskets. He believed in the superiority of the Union soldier and the discipline of the drill. He called the guerrillas cowards and wolves, declaring that he would wipe them from the face of the earth before the sun set. Johnston ordered his column to form up. He left a small detachment to guard the wagons in the town, taking approximately 120 men with him for the pursuit. They rode out of Centralia, heading southeast, following the obvious trampled trail left by the guerrilla horses. The mood in the Union ranks was a mix of righteous fury and creeping dread. These were not seasoned veterans of the Deep South campaigns. They were largely raw recruits, farm boys and shopkeepers who had joined the regiment to protect their homes. They gripped their long muskets with sweaty hands, looking at the distant tree line of Young's Creek with a growing sense of unease. The terrain was open, a rolling ocean of dry autumn grass that offered no cover, sloping gently down toward the dense wall of timber where the enemy waited. William Anderson watched the approach of the blue column from the concealment of the brush. He sat on his bay mare, perfectly still, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the distance. He had expected a pursuit, but he had not expected the Union commander to be so obliging as to ride straight into the killing jar. Anderson had positioned his main force in the shape of a horseshoe, hidden within the dip of the land and the edge of the woods. He had George Todd's men on the right flank and his own scalp hunters on the left. In the center, he placed a small decoy squad of 10 men, instructing them to show themselves and draw the Federals in. The decoy worked with tragic precision. Johnston saw the handful of riders near the creek and assumed it was the rear guard of a fleeing enemy. He ordered his men to quicken their pace. As the Union column crested the long slope leading down to the creek, the full trap was not yet visible. The guerrillas in the timber held their fire, their hands resting on the bridles of their mounts to keep them quiet. The silence on the field was heavy, broken only by the jingle of the Union bits and the thud of hooves on the dry sod. Anderson waited. He wanted them closer. He wanted them so deep in the pocket that escape was a physical impossibility. When the Union force reached the bottom of the incline, roughly 200 yards from the woods, Major Johnston made the decision that would seal the fate of every man under his command. He halted the column. Seeing the difficult terrain of the creek bed and believing he was facing a disorganized rabble that would break under disciplined volley fire, he ordered his men to dismount. It was a tactical error of catastrophic proportions. The 39th Missouri swung down from their saddles. Every fourth man was detailed to hold the horses, taking the mounts to the rear. The remaining 90 or so men formed a skirmish line on foot, shoulder to shoulder, their boots planted in the grass. They fixed bayonets, the steel clicking onto the muzzles of their single-shot Enfields. Anderson watched this maneuver with a look of genuine disbelief that quickly morphed into a wolfish grin. The Union officer had voluntarily surrendered his mobility. He had turned a cavalry engagement into a shooting gallery. Anderson turned to Archie Clement, who sat beside him, quivering with anticipation. The moment had arrived. Anderson raised his hat with the ostrich plume high in the air, the signal that would unleash the storm. "Charge!" The order was not screamed. It was delivered with a guttural intensity that carried down the line. The woods erupted. 350 guerrillas burst from the timber and the ravines. They did not come in a disorganized wave. They came in a solid, thundering wall of horseflesh and steel. The sheer noise was deafening. The sudden roar of hundreds of horses accelerating to a gallop, the rebel yell screaming from hundreds of throats, and the earth shaking under the impact of the charge. Major Johnston stood in the center of his thin blue line, his sword drawn. He watched the horizon fill with the enemy. He realized instantly that he had been deceived. The force bearing down on him was not a small band of outlaws. It was a regiment of executioners. He shouted for his men to hold their fire, to wait for the range. The Union soldiers, their faces drained of color, raised their muskets. They were staring at death rushing toward them at 30 miles an hour. The guerrillas leaned low over the necks of their horses, their reins in their teeth, a revolver in each hand. They presented a terrifyingly small target. At 100 yards, Johnston gave the order to fire. The Union line erupted in a single ragged volley of white smoke. The roar of the muskets momentarily drowned out the thunder of the charge. But the aim was high. Most of the balls whistled harmlessly over the heads of the guerrillas or struck the horses. A few bushwhackers fell, but the momentum of the charge was unchecked. The wall of horses punched through the smoke before the Union soldiers could even think about reloading their muzzle loaders. A single-shot weapon was a death sentence against men carrying 6 revolvers. The collision was horrific. The guerrillas did not stop to shoot from a distance. They rode straight into the Union line, using their horses as battering rams. The physical impact of the heavy mounts smashing into the standing infantry knocked men flying like 9 pins. Bones snapped under the hooves. As the guerrillas crashed through the ranks, they opened fire at point-blank range. The air filled with the rapid cracking reports of the Colt navies and dragoons. It was not a battle. It was an industrial slaughter. Anderson rode directly at Major Johnston. The major tried to raise his sword, but Anderson fired first. The ball struck Johnston in the head, killing him instantly. He fell backward into the grass, his command ending seconds after the first shot. Around him, his men were being annihilated. The Union soldiers tried to use their bayonets, thrusting desperately at the swirling horsemen, but the guerrillas were too fast. They circled the infantry, firing downward with ruthless precision. Men were shot in the face, the neck, and the chest. These revolver balls, heavy and moving at low velocity, tore massive wounds in the soft tissue. The skirmish line disintegrated in less than a minute. The survivors threw down their empty muskets and tried to run, but a man on foot cannot outrun a quarter horse. The guerrillas hunted them down individually. Anderson's men laughed as they rode alongside the fleeing soldiers, taunting them before putting a ball in their backs. The grass was slick with blood, making footing treacherous. The screams of the dying men mixed with the triumphant shouts of the bushwhackers. The horseholders in the rear, seeing the massacre of the skirmish line, panicked. They tried to mount the spare horses or let them go and flee toward Centralia. It was futile. A detachment of guerrillas led by George Todd swept around the flanks and cut off the retreat. The horseholders were trapped against a fence line. They were shot down where they stood. There was no quarter given. Men who fell to their knees with their hands raised were shot in the face without hesitation. Anderson had issued a standing order. No prisoners. Archie Clement was in the thick of the melee, a demon of motion. He rode through the smoke, firing until his pistols were empty, then drawing fresh ones from his saddle holsters. He did not just shoot to kill, he shot to destroy. He targeted the wounded, putting finishing rounds into men who were already down. The ferocity of the attack was absolute. Within 10 minutes of the first shot, the entire Union detachment of 120 men was dead or dying. The firing tapered off from a roar to sporadic pops as the guerrillas finished off the survivors. The silence that followed was heavy and wet. The sun beat down on the field of Young's Creek, illuminating a scene that defied the conventions of civilized warfare. The bodies of the Union soldiers lay in heaps where the line had stood and scattered in trails where they had tried to run. Anderson rode his heaving, sweating horse back to the center of the field. He surveyed the work. It was total. Almost no man from the skirmish line had escaped. Then began the mutilation. This was the moment where Anderson's war severed all ties with humanity. He dismounted and walked among the corpses. He signaled to his men. "Take what you want," he said. "Mark them." The guerrillas descended on the dead like locusts. They stripped the bodies of boots, uniforms, and personal effects, leaving the white skin exposed to the sun and the insects. But theft was the least of the indignities. The knives came out. Clement led the way, grabbing the hair of a dead sergeant and slicing the scalp away with a practiced circular motion. He shook the blood from the trophy and tied it to his saddle. The other men followed suit. The sound of tearing skin and the wet slick of blood on steel filled the afternoon air. The atrocities escalated into the grotesque. Anderson watched as his men decapitated several of the corpses. They swapped the heads, placing the head of a blond soldier on the body of a dark-haired man, laughing at the macabre joke. They cut off noses and ears, stuffing them into the pockets of the dead or keeping them as grisly souvenirs. The sexual mutilation was particularly savage. Several bodies were castrated, the severed organs shoved into the mouths of the corpses. It was a display of dominance, a message written in flesh that they were the masters of life and death. Anderson found the body of Major Johnston. The officer lay on his back, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Anderson stood over him, looking down with cold contempt. He did not touch the body himself, but he allowed his men to desecrate it. They stripped the major of his fine uniform and his sword. They cut off his nose. Anderson wanted the Union command to know exactly what happened to officers who dared to hunt him. He wanted Johnston to be a warning that would rot in the memory of the department for years. The field at Young's Creek looked like the floor of a slaughterhouse. The grass was trampled flat and stained a deep, rusty red. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of bowels, blood, brain matter, and gunpowder. The guerrillas moved through the carnage with casual indifference, wiping their knives on the grass or their pant legs. They reloaded their revolvers, the metallic clicks the only mechanical sounds in a landscape of organic ruin. They caught the loose Union horses, adding the fresh mounts to their herd. Anderson remounted. He looked at the devastation one last time. He had achieved the impossible. He had wiped out an entire command in open battle, inflicting 100% casualties while suffering only 3 dead and 10 wounded in his own ranks. It was a tactical masterpiece and a moral abyss. He touched the silk cord in his pocket. He would need a new cord. This one could not hold the number of knots required for the day's work. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the field. The buzzards which had been circling the train wreckage at Centralia began to drift toward Young's Creek, drawn by the scent of the fresh feast. Anderson turned his horse away from the dead. He felt a hollow, vibrating energy in his chest. The rage that fueled him was not satiated, it was merely fed. The slaughter at Young's Creek was the apex of his career as a guerrilla chieftain. He had proven that he could meet the Federals in the open and crush them. He led his column back toward the timber, leaving the 120 bodies to the elements. The men were loud, boasting of their kills, comparing scalps, holding up bloody boots and watches. Anderson rode in silence at the head of the column. He knew that this event would bring the full weight of the United States Army down on him. There would be no more small patrols, no more militia. They would send legions. And he welcomed it. As they entered the shade of the woods, the temperature dropped, but the heat of the blood on their hands remained. The afternoon of September 27th had changed the nature of the war in Missouri forever. It was no longer a conflict of territory. It was a conflict of existence. Anderson had shown the world the face of total war, and it was a face without eyes, stripped of skin, grinning in the grass. The slaughter was complete. The destination was Albany, and the end of the road was calling him. But for tonight, he was the king of the dead. October 26, 1864 arrived in Ray County, Missouri, with a damp, penetrating chill that signaled the death of autumn and the approach of a hard winter. The leaves on the oak and hickory trees had turned the color of dried blood, clinging precariously to branches that rattled in the biting wind. The ground was soft, a treacherous paste of mud and rotting vegetation churning under the hooves of the horses. William Anderson rode through this bleak landscape near the small settlement of Albany, just south of Orick, with a sense of inevitability hanging over him like a shroud. The massacre at Centralia a month prior had not satisfied his hunger. It had merely painted a target on his back so large that every Union soldier in the department was looking for him. The Federal forces were no longer fearful militia patrols. They were hunting columns, driven by a mandate from the highest levels of command to exterminate the man who had butchered their comrades. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel P. Cox, commanding the 33rd Enrolled Missouri Militia, had moved his troops into position with a quiet, desperate professionalism. Cox was a prudent officer, well aware of the fate that had befallen Major Johnston at Centralia. He knew that engaging Anderson in the open was suicide. He knew that the guerrillas possessed superior firepower and superior mounts. Therefore, Cox did not plan a battle. He planned an assassination disguised as a skirmish. He positioned his men in a dense line of timber crossing a muddy lane, using the heavy undergrowth and the lay of the land to mask his numbers. He ordered his soldiers to dismount to check the caps on their muskets and to lie flat in the leaf litter. Silence was the primary weapon. Anderson's column, numbering roughly 300 men, moved with a sluggish arrogance. They were tired. The weeks following Centralia had been a blur of constant movement, dodging the heavy cavalry columns of General Calm raiding. isolated farmhouses for food and sleeping in cold, wet bivouacs. The horses were gaunt, their ribs showing through their winter coats. The men were haggard, their eyes rimmed with red, their clothes stiff with grease and dirt. Anderson rode at the front as always, but the manic energy that had driven him in September had cooled into a dark, fatalistic mood. He wore a heavy coat over his Guerrilla shirt, his 4 revolvers protected from the damp air by the leather of his holsters. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the scouts reported movement ahead. Anderson spurred his horse forward, flanked by his most loyal lieutenant, Archie Clement, and a handful of the fiercest fighters. They emerged from the trees into a clearing that fed into the lane where Cox was waiting. Anderson saw the Union skirmishers, a small group of men Cox had placed as bait. Just as at Centralia, the bait was intended to provoke the predator's instinct to chase. Anderson looked at the blue coats and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. He did not pause to reconnoiter. He did not send flankers to check the woods. He assumed, with the fatal hubris of a man who has never lost a fight, that these were just more frightened militia who would break at the first shot. Anderson turned in his saddle and shouted the order. "Charge them! Ride them down!" He did not wait for the main body of his force to form a line. He kicked his bay mare into a gallop and charged straight at the bait, accompanied by only 20 or so men who were close enough to hear the command. It was a reckless, disjointed attack. The horses struggled for traction in the deep mud, their hooves sucking and popping in the mire. Anderson leaned forward, his reins in his teeth, a pistol in each hand, screaming the rebel yell. The sound was thin and ragged in the cold air, lacking the overwhelming volume of the Centralia charge. Major Cox watched the approaching riders from his concealed position in the brush. He saw the leader, the man with the long hair and the ostrich plume, the man whose name terrified the entire state. Cox held his nerve. He waited until the guerrillas were deep into the kill zone, splashing through a shallow crossing, their momentum committed. The distance closed to 50 yards, 40 yards, 30 yards. "Fire!" Cox screamed. The woods exploded. The volley from the 33rd Missouri was not the ragged, high fire of the raw troops at Centralia. It was a disciplined, crashing wall of hot ball and buckshot. Hundreds of muskets discharged simultaneously, sending a storm of metal tearing through the brush and into the lane. The sound was deafening, a physical blow that shook the wet trees. The smoke billowed out instantly, a thick white fog that obscured the target. Anderson rode straight into the center of the volley. 2 heavy musket balls struck him almost simultaneously. One slug hit him in the side, tearing through his ribs and devastating his internal organs. The second ball struck him behind the ear, crashing through the skull and exiting near the eye. The impact was catastrophic. It lifted him out of the saddle as if he had been jerked by an invisible wire. He was dead before his body hit the mud. His mare also hit, screamed, and went down, thrashing in the mire. The charge disintegrated instantly. The men riding with Anderson were cut to pieces. Several other guerrillas fell, their bodies tumbling into the wet leaves. Archie Clement, seeing his captain fall, tried to rally the men, but the volume of fire from the woods was too intense. The Union troops, emboldened by the sight of the falling chieftain, rose from their cover and poured a second volley into the confused mass of horsemen. The guerrillas, realizing the trap, wheeled their horses in a panic. They broke and fled, scattering back into the timber, leaving their leader lying face down in the dirt. The firing tapered off. The smoke drifted slowly through the dripping trees. Major Cox ordered his men to advance, but to do so with caution. He knew the trickery of the bushwhackers and feared a ruse. The soldiers moved forward, their bayonets fixed, stepping carefully through the mud. They approached the body of the man in the fine coat. A soldier reached out with his musket barrel and prodded the corpse. There was no movement. They rolled the body over. The face of William Anderson stared up at the gray sky. It was a ruin of blood and bone, but the features were unmistakable. The long, dark hair, now matted with gore and mud, framed the face that had haunted the nightmares of thousands. The eyes were open, glazed, and dull. The mouth was slack. The terror of Missouri was just a piece of meat cooling in the October air. The soldiers stood over him, looking down with a mixture of awe and revulsion. They could hardly believe that this small, broken thing was the monster of Centralia. The men began to search the body. They found a small arsenal on his person. He carried 4 revolvers, 2 heavy dragoons, and 2 Navy Colts, all loaded and capped. In his pockets, they found a substantial amount of gold coin and greenbacks, the proceeds of the robberies at Huntsville and Centralia. They found the silk cord, the tally of his murders knotted intricately along its length. They found orders from General Price confirming his rank as a captain, a piece of paper that Anderson had carried as a shield against the accusation of being a common outlaw. Cox ordered the body secured. He knew that the death of Anderson had to be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. If the body was lost or buried in an unmarked grave, the legend would survive. Rumors would spread that he had escaped, that he was healing in a cave, that he would return in the spring. Cox needed the corpse as a political trophy. They threw the body onto a wagon, the head lolling loosely with every bump in the road, and transported it to the nearby town of Richmond, Missouri. The journey to Richmond was a grim procession. The rain began to fall harder, washing the blood from the wagon bed onto the road. The soldiers marched with a lighter step, knowing that the primary threat to their lives had been extinguished. When they arrived in Richmond, the news spread like wildfire. "They got him!" men shouted from the porches. "Bloody Bill is dead." Crowds began to gather, ignoring the rain, desperate to see the proof. The body was taken to the courthouse. It was carried inside and laid out on a rough wooden table. The local photographer, Robert B. Keiss, was summoned. This was a crucial step in the documentation of the death. Keiss set up his heavy camera, the tripod legs splaying on the floorboards. The Union soldiers wanted the photo to be a spectacle. They propped Anderson's body up, placing a large stone in his hand to hold his arm across his chest, displaying the Guerrilla shirt and the revolvers they placed back on his corpse for the image. The photograph that was taken that day captured the grisly reality of the border war. Anderson's eyes were half open, staring at nothing. His face was swollen and stained. His clothes were mud-spattered. He looked small, dirty, and utterly defeated. The image was not one of a romantic cavalier. It was an image of a dead criminal. This photograph would be printed and distributed, sold as a postcard, a macabre souvenir that signaled the end of the worst atrocities. But the indignities did not end with the photograph. The hatred for Anderson ran so deep that mere death was insufficient. The crowd outside the courthouse grew rowdy. They wanted to tear the body apart. The soldiers, struggling to maintain order, allowed a certain amount of desecration. The body was dragged through the streets, the mud grinding into the dead flesh. Finally, the ultimate act of symbolic revenge was enacted. A local doctor, or perhaps a soldier with surgical knowledge, approached the corpse with a knife, in a mirror image of the atrocities of Anderson had inflicted on the Union troops. His head was severed from his body. The details of this act were hushed up in official reports, often denied, but the oral history of the region and the accounts of witnesses were clear. The head was taken and mounted on a telegraph pole or a high stake near the courthouse. It was a medieval display, a warning to any remaining bushwhackers that the rules of war were suspended for them as well. The sight of the severed head, with its long hair blowing in the wind, marked the psychological turning point of the war in Missouri. The invincible demon had been reduced to a grotesque ornament. The fear that had paralyzed the region broke. If Anderson could be killed and butchered, then the others, Clement James Younger, were mortal too. The spell of the scalp hunters was shattered. The headless body was eventually buried in a potter's field outside Richmond, in an unmarked grave intended to be lost to history. There were no prayers, no eulogies. He was put in the ground like a dead dog. Years later, a former guerrilla and friend would locate the grave and place a simple stone. But on that wet October day, he was interred with nothing but the hatred of the community he had tormented. The impact of Anderson's death on his followers was immediate and devastating. Archie Clement took command of the shattered remnants of the band, but the cohesive fury was gone. Without Anderson's singular driving madness, the group fractured. They continued to kill, continued to rob, but they were hunted men now, running for their lives rather than seeking conquest. The large-scale raids, the sacking of towns, the open battles, those died with Anderson in the mud at Albany. The legacy of William Anderson was a scar across the history of the West. He had introduced a level of ferocity that had never been seen in American warfare. He had normalized the mutilation of the dead. He had erased the distinction between combatant and civilian. His war was not about politics or states' rights. It was about the expression of pure, unadulterated rage. He proved that under the right pressure, civilized men could descend into absolute barbarism. As the sun set on October 26th, the rain turned to sleet. The town of Richmond quieted down, the crowds dispersing to their warm fires, leaving the mutilated remains of the guerrilla captain in the dark. The war would drag on for another 6 months, but the summer of terror was officially over. The ghost of the railroad tracks, the butcher of Centralia, the man who wore scalps on his bridle was gone. In the end, Anderson did not change the outcome of the Civil War. He did not save the Confederacy. He did not liberate Missouri. He simply created a legacy of pain. He proved that one man motivated by revenge and stripped of empathy could turn a lush green land into a slaughterhouse. His life was a testament to the destructive power of the vendetta. The telegraph lines which Anderson had cut so many times were repaired. The trains began to run again on the North Missouri Railroad. The towns rebuilt their burned stores. The grass grew over the bones at Young's Creek. But the memory remained. The story of Bloody Bill became a dark folklore, whispered to children to keep them in their beds. He became the boogeyman of the border, the shadow in the woods, the reminder that civilization is a thin veneer over a deep red ocean of violence. The final image of the war in North Missouri was not a treaty signing or a parade. It was the image of that severed head rotting on a pole in the cold autumn rain, staring blindly out at a world that had finally brutally struck back. The circle of violence that began with the death of his father and the collapse of the jail had closed. The executioner had been executed. The road that started in the high grass of Kansas ended in the deep mud of Ray County, and the silence that followed was the silence of the grave.